Welcome to my channel, where I dive into the darkest horror narratives. Got a chilling story, real or imagined, that you want me to narrate? Drop it in the comments below. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales. Now close your eyes and let the terror begin. Road to 100. Story 1, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. My friends and I have always been pranksters. Our four-man group is comprised of Ricky, Danny, Taika, and myself. This story is about the consequences of our actions. Occasionally, we tend to go a little too far. A prank is a form of affection in our eyes. We never hold a grudge or do anything out of malice. At least that's what I thought. Ricky suggested that we kick our senior year off with something that had a chance to go viral on Halloween. Naturally, the rest of us didn't need much convincing. All we needed was an idea. Now, we all have our preferences, so that wasn't going to be an easy task. Me, I'm all about the laughs. Probably because when I was little, I'd get called a clown because of my bright red hair, though I eventually embraced it. I thought it'd be hilarious to buy a bunch of blow-up dolls and place them selectively throughout our school. The reactions from teachers, students, and whoever else saw them would be gold. Plus, who knows how long it'd be before they were all found. Even now, thinking about it cracks a smile on my face. Danny likes freaking people out. He has that edgelord vibe to him, which is exactly what he looks like. He wanted to fill the bathrooms with pests, and then make a ruckus and scare the living shit out of people. It would have been funny, but that doesn't seem like something the school would look the other way on. I'm not looking to pay the janitorial fees for that either. Taika likes to confuse people. He does the most random stuff. You'd never expect the tall, innocent-looking kid to be as bizarre as he is. One time he tricked a gym class into removing their shoes, only to hide all the left ones. Another time, he wore a different costume to school every day for a month. In April. He never told anyone why. That's the kind of guy he is. Lastly, there is Ricky, the ringleader of our little group. His style is unpredictable. He gives off smaller, more sadistic Logan Paul vibes. I've seen him write 150 love letters, one for every girl in our grade, and give out one per day for nearly the entire year just to make them smile. I've also seen him hotwire a car, steal it, and then hop out and crash it because it was blocking his driveway. He carried a flask in his jacket for the majority of the last year and a half at school, for crying out loud. The guy is fucking crazy, but I'll be damned if I don't love him. We all appreciate each other's styles, but something this big couldn't be a collaborative idea. So we did what any rational group of high school males would do. We let a homeless guy outside the liquor store choose. Who do you think he sided with? Guys, you're going to love it. We're going to freak the fuck out of people. Someone might literally shit their pants. Then we can post all the best reactions online. Well, that's all I needed to hear. I knew Danny would be in too. I looked over at Taika, who nodded in approval. Ricky explained the gist of it to us. He had found a group online called Scare Lair. They set up the craziest haunted houses you could imagine. They only accepted online requests for them to come to your town. If you made a compelling enough case and sent in a deposit, they would come to town and deliver the scariest experience possible. They would do the setup and everything, and they guaranteed that whoever participated would have their lives changed forever. It was literally their tagline. No one comes out the same. Instead of a regular haunted house, we were going to turn it into a game with a prize, a la Mr. Beast, and prank the living hell out of a few people. We scrounged together a few $1,000s between the 5 of us. and submitted our request. Days went by without a response. Days turned to weeks, and as Halloween neared, we had begun to lose hope. The Monday before Halloween, we heard back. They reached out to Ricky and wanted to schedule a call to talk details. We scheduled it for that night. We were ecstatic. I tried to look them up online, but it was hard to find anything on them. But Ricky was more resourceful and tech-savvy than I am, even with his piece of shit decade-old phone. So I didn't think about it too much. When 7 p.m. rolled around, all of us huddled together and waited. Ricky's phone started vibrating. Oddly enough, it said he was receiving a call from me. Obviously, a glitch, because I was staring right at my cell, and I clearly wasn't calling him. He answered and put it on the speaker. "Hey guys, this is Matt from Scare Lair. It sounded like you wanted to make some changes to the usual stuff we do. What did you have in mind?" he asked. Taika leaned over to me and said, "Dude looks kinda sketch." So we were thinking of turning it into a game with a prize. Haunted houses are cool and all, but if you're not into that stuff, you're not going to be talked into it, right? If we made it a game with a cash prize, then more people could be persuaded. Know what I mean? Yeah, I hear you. Did you have certain people in mind? How many people were you thinking? We all looked at each other. "Well," asked Danny, "I'm thinking 5 people. One of us would take a spot to kind of help steer things along." Ricky added, "I don't think you need to worry about it, but hey, if that's what you want, that's fine. Should we include your friend in the game, or mostly let him be?" "Let him be, just to be safe," I blurted out. If it ended up being me, I didn't want to be the one soiling his pants and then having that go viral. "Sounds good. We'll have everything set up by Saturday. We'll do some social media marketing to get some buzz. If you have particular people you want in it, text me the details," Matt said. "Anything else?" "So how do you guys make money?" Danny asked. "Don't get me wrong. We're over the moon you're doing this for us, but $3,000 can't go that far toward equipment. We live stream all of our events and get tons of donations. To help with your game idea, we'll actually put $1,000 of what you gave us as a cash prize. Anything else?" I looked at Taika and shrugged. Danny looked to Ricky. "You guys are the experts, right? We'll let you take care of the rest," he said. "Perfect." Matt said he'd text us the rest of the details the next day. Just like that, we were in business. We decided that Danny would be the one to join the random people in the game. His antics would make for the most epic inclusion. Ricky told us he submitted a big list of potential people to include. He put out flyers that advertised winning $1,000 by surviving the scariest haunted house of all time. By Wednesday, the remaining 4 players had been decided and had accepted their invitations. Those 4 were Allison Beckham, a girl Ricky once had a fling with. Picture Anna Kendrick if she wasn't witty. Kyle Conklin, Allison's current boyfriend, and someone you'd expect to be extremely successful someday. Anders Lucas, the quiet, nerdy type with messy dark hair. Finally, Tana Schultz, who would be best described as a B-list popular girl, and not because of her personality. As soon as I saw Allison and Kyle were in, I knew they were going to have a bad time. Ricky would make sure of that. We met with Matt on Thursday to check out the venue and finalize everything. We drove up in my dad's truck and arrived at a massive warehouse. Matt and a few others walked out to greet us. He looked kinder in person. I peered over at Taika, and I could tell he felt the same. "Hey guys, come on in and check everything out. We want to know what you think," Matt said. We all walked in, and upon seeing the layout, We all let out an audible gasp. I don't know what exactly we were expecting, but it wasn't this. These guys were absolute professionals, and the place looked amazing. From floor to ceiling, the place was decked out to look like the creepiest graveyard of all time. Headstones casting long shadows, empty graves, demonic symbols flickered in eerie candlelight. Even the grass appeared unsettling. Matt led us to the right and unlocked some doors. Then we followed him up a staircase. He opened another door at the top. There were monitors everywhere showing dozens of different angles of the layout. Anything that happened down there, we'd be able to see from here. So a couple things, Matt started. We go all out. Do not go downstairs while the game is ongoing. It's not safe. Stay here where you can watch and enjoy together. We'll record everything on our servers and send you the files after about a week. Danny, you'll want to wear a green shirt to let our guys know you're in the clear. Make sure you tell each of our other guests playing not to wear green. Everyone will drop their phones in the box at the entrance, so nothing disturbs the experience. We'll have a tech guy standing by. If you need him, just hit the yellow key over here. If you have any non-tech issues, you'll want to hit the red key. That'll start up a live chat with Jimmy. These events can get intense, and Jimmy deals with these all the time, so he'll be able to help you out with anything you need. He'll be on site in another room. We thanked him for his help and went our separate ways. Now all we had to do was wait. Ricky received a text the next day saying preparations were complete, and that on Saturday we should arrive an hour early. That way, we could get in and away from everything before anyone arrived. He also sent out the dress code instructions to everyone playing. The next few days were agonizingly slow. All we could think about was Saturday. Finally, the day arrived. As requested, we showed up early and got ourselves situated. We all wore black, hanging by the entrance, except Danny, who was wearing orange. "Weren't you supposed to wear green?" Taika asked. "Oh, come on, Taika, live a little. Of anyone here, I'm the most likely to be into this kind of stuff. Besides, green doesn't really fit the Halloween spirit." "I'm not sure that's a great idea," I started. "Bro, it's fine. I have a green hat in my bag, just in case." Taika shrugged. Ricky rolled his eyes. We made our way up the stairs and stepped into the control room. "This is going to be so sick," Ricky said, pulling out his flask and taking a sip of vodka. We couldn't wait to see what was going to go down. Minutes flew by, and one by one, the targets had arrived. "Well, boys, I'll see you on the other side," Danny said. He grabbed a walkie, left the control room, and headed downstairs. "Best of luck, bitch," Ricky yelled after him, laughing. One by one, the players arrived. They were ushered into a small room. Danny entered the room last. He snuck up behind Tana and tapped her, forcing her to jump up and let out a squeal. She flipped around and scowled. "Oh, great. You're with us," she said sarcastically. "Nice to see you too, Tana," Danny replied. "I see you were able to follow the dress code." He motioned towards her maid costume. "Like I'd be caught dead wearing green in public," she responded, disgusted. She took a step closer to Allison and Kyle, who were dressed up as Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. Allison shifted her body awkwardly towards Kyle. "Hey, Danny," she said. "Allison," Danny replied. Kyle noticed Allison's uncomfortable expression and placed his arm around her. Danny frowned. "Wait, like who the fuck is that?" Tana asked, looking at the quiet boy in the oversized black t-shirt and sweatpants in the corner. "I'm Anders." Tana's confused expression didn't change. "Tana, we've all been in class together since grade school. Come on," Kyle said. "I didn't know," she said, waving her arms. Allison gave her a disapproving scowl. Anders looked down and started rubbing his right arm. "Well, I like your costume," he said quietly. "Yeah, thanks," she responded coldly. Suddenly the lights turned off, plunging the room into complete darkness. The two girls screamed. "The game has begun." Dim blood-red lighting cast an eerie glow, allowing the players to regain some of their vision, and a thick fog encompassed the area. The gate slowly creaked open. Everyone exchanged nervous glances and then walked to the graveyard that lay ahead. Before them loomed 3 massive graves. The headstones, from left to right, read the unknown, demonic, and slasher. "Welcome, players. Please choose a path." "Hey, so how do we win the $1,000? Allison asked. "Survive," the automated voice retaliated. "Spooky?" Kyle laughed. We watched as Allison, Kyle, and Tana walked to the middle grave. Anders and Danny both walked to the right. The ground seemingly came alive as deformed hands sprouted from the earth beneath them. The group all jumped. "Jesus Christ!" Tana cried out, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. That response is invalid. Each grave must be occupied." More hands started to pop up out of the ground. Their grotesque fingers brushed against the players' ankles. Low, whooshing sounds began to play in the background. "Can we make a decision, please?" Allison urged. "These things are so creepy." We signaled Danny that he should take the left door. "Fine, I'll take the left," he said. "Great, we're all settled." "Let's go," Tana said, trying to sound brave. "No, we're not. Tana, go with Anders. We can't make him go alone. Danny loves this stuff, so he'll be fine. But Anders looks uncomfortable already," Allison said. "Forget that. You two just want to dump me off on him so you can find a place to have fun." She looked over at Anders. "No offense." "Sure," he replied. He twitched as another hand grazed his foot. "Fine, I'll do it," Kyle said. "I got you, buddy. Let's do this." Kyle extended his fist out to Anders. Anders studied him for a second before he reached out and bumped it with his own. "Yay," Allison said, rolling her eyes. "Thanks, Tana." With that, each group climbed down into their grave. A tunnel was beneath each of them, and they all headed forward. Danny entered the unknown, Allison and Tana entered demonic, and Kyle and Anders entered slasher. The tunnels were surprisingly long, and each one was unique. The unknown was a pitch-black abyss, except for Danny's neon orange shirt. Inside demonic was a cave, and the further it went along, the tighter it became. A rhythmic noise could be heard faintly. Allison and Tana eventually had to crawl forward to be able to go ahead. "I'm getting serious claustrophobia here," Tana said. Crawling through the rigid cave was scratching up her knees and elbows. "You could have been with Anders right now, if you hadn't been so rude to him earlier." Allison scoffed. The rhythmic sound was getting louder. I know. That's how I am. But I'm nice when it matters. Look, I'll apologize to him when we meet back up. Promise." The slasher tunnel was full of dirt that Kyle and Anders had to crawl through. Kyle's white jersey had quickly been stained brown. "Good thing I didn't get the authentic jersey, huh, Anders?" Kyle laughed. Anders smiled. "You can't even tell with what I'm wearing," he replied. "The smartest one of us all, I see." "Teach me your ways, Sensei," Kyle responded. "Hey, I think I see where this tunnel opens up." "Danny, do you copy?" Ricky said. We peered at his monitor and saw the silhouette of him raise the walkie. He held it close to his shirt so we could see, and motioned that he couldn't hear what we were saying. "How about now?" He shrugged and shook his head. "What a bummer. I was looking forward to the random stuff he was gonna do," Taika said. "You're the random one, Taika, but not getting to see what messed up ideas Danny had is going to make this less fun." "Oh, we'll still have plenty," Ricky replied, grinning. I can't believe how lucky we are that we got your ex, her current boy toy, and a brat like Tana all in one group, I said. I wouldn't exactly call it luck. Ricky smirked. What do you mean? Taika asked. Well, if you're going to scare the shit out of people as a prank, you might as well choose who, right? And if you're going to choose, why not make it people you want to see embarrassed? Didn't you give Matt a big list? Nope, just these 4. Why? I asked. Because I fucking hate them. Duh. I stood there for a moment, puzzled. I get Allison and Kyle, but the others? Come on, Tana's the biggest bitch in school. We all know if she wasn't hot, no one would put up with her shit, Ricky replied. And Anders? Taika asked. He's always rubbed me the wrong way. I hate his style, his quiet demeanor, all of it. Dude, what the fuck? He's just shy. The other's fine, whatever. But Anders is a completely innocent kid, I replied. Too late now, Ricky shrugged. We turned our attention back to the monitors. This had put a damper on the mood, but at this point, I still wanted to have fun. Hey, where did Danny go? Taika asked. Ricky and I looked at his monitor, and it was pitch black. We can't see or hear him, so much for him guiding things, I whined. No, it's fine. Look. We saw Kyle and Anders crawl their way up through another hole above them to exit the tunnel. This led them to what looked like a floor of an abandoned hospital. On a separate monitor, 2 workers were making their way towards them. One looked like he was wearing something inspired by Leatherface, and the other wore a mask that was completely blank. They were closing in. Here we go, boys. Kyle and Anders were aimlessly walking down their corridor. Leaky faucets and old monitors could be heard in some of the abandoned patients' rooms. They really went all out with this, Kyle said, as he passed by a shredded curtain. Yeah, Anders replied. He turned the corner and jumped back. There was a corpse wearing a hospital gown. Kyle ran his fingers over the body, his curiosity getting the best of him. That feels crazy real. Then he pinched his nose. Smells that way, too. Holy shit, that's gross. Anders nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. I don't like it. They navigated through the hallway. Shadows danced and flickered along the walls, projecting ominous shapes that seemed to taunt them. Each sound, innocuous or not, sent a jolt of adrenaline through their bodies, heightening their senses. Something isn't right, Anders confessed, his voice laced with apprehension. We shouldn't have signed up for this. Kyle gave him a reassuring smile. We knew it would be scary, but remember why we're here. The challenge, the adrenaline. It's all part of the experience. Anders nodded, though his unease persisted. They continued down the corridor, their steps cautious and measured. Suddenly the sound of footsteps rang down the hall. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end as they turned to face the source. Emerging from the darkness were 2 figures. One, wearing a leather mask, took a bow. The other donned a completely blank mask. The masked men moved with purpose, closing the distance to Kyle and Anders. This is getting intense, Kyle muttered. His heart raced. He exchanged a quick glance with Anders. The blank masked man was steadily advancing towards them. Anders glanced at Kyle, his eyes wide with fear. We need to do something, Kyle. We can't just stand here. Our entrance did say slasher, so let's run. Without hesitation, he grabbed Anders' arm and pulled him around the nearest corner. They sprinted through the narrow corridor, their hearts pounding in their chests. Kyle glanced back and saw both of the masked men had increased their pace and were now sprinting towards them. They're coming, he yelled out. The sound of footsteps behind them followed, growing louder and closer. They could feel the presence of the leather-masked man trailing just a few steps behind. The path twisted and turned, seeming to extend endlessly, but they pressed on. Finally, they dipped into an empty room. Gasping for breath, they slowly peeked outside the room, expecting the masked men to be right behind them. That was actually pretty fun, Anders said, breathing heavily. It was, wasn't it? Kyle replied, scanning their surroundings warily. But let's stay alert. They could be anywhere. With that, a door disguised as a wall shifted, and the blank masked man entered the room. Kyle and Anders picked themselves up, ready to exit, only to see the leather-masked man before them with a machete. All right. You guys caught us," Kyle laughed. "I guess you win. What happens now?" "That blade looks real," Anders whispered. "Don't be silly. They'd never let them use real wape." Before he could finish, the man in the leather mask plunged the blade deep into Kyle's abdomen. He released a guttural wail, reflexively stumbling back, hands clutching his wound. Anders' body was still as stone. It was as if he was completely mesmerized by what he was seeing. The masked man lunged with the blade once again. Kyle looked at Anders, pale in the face, gazing into his hypnotized eyes, and motioned toward the exit. Anders snapped back to reality, immediately taking off as the other masked man gave Bashwian chase. We watched all of this from the control room, and we burst out laughing. "Holy shit, that was epic," I cheered. "I can't believe how good they made that look," Taika said. "That's crazy." "And Anders booking it like that," Ricky chimed in. Watching Anders run like that was hilarious. He was legitimately terrified. What a pussy. The man in the leather mask continued to slash at Kyle to the point where it was getting uncomfortable to watch. Kyle was playing this up like a champ. His screams were spine-tingling. But who was he screaming for? I guess this was the scare lair experience, right? The moment red spots started appearing on Kyle's clothing, we came to a sickening realization. I know Kyle, and he wouldn't go this far as to fake bleed to scare someone like Anders. Kyle stumbled backward, collapsing to the ground, gasping for air. He looked up at his attacker with nothing short of pure terror in his eyes. The man in the mask wiped his blade clean and then walked away from Kyle. He peered down at him and paused. Then he left. The control room had gone completely silent. That was real blood, and those were real screams. Crimson streaks were running down Kyle's chin. He coughed, and a viscous red fluid exited. He was losing a lot of blood now. Was he dying? My body was frozen with fear. I kept watching, hoping, praying for someone to jump out and say it was all fake, that we were the ones getting pranked. "Ricky, where did you find these guys again?" Taika asked. Ricky mumbled his response. "Ricky," I yelled. "The dark web," he replied. "What?" we yelled in unison. Suddenly Anders snuck back into the frame, and he extended his hand to Kyle. Kyle smiled before shaking his head. "Much appreciated, but I think I'm a goner at this point," Kyle whispered. "Protect yourself, buddy. Do whatever you have to do to survive." Anders rubbed his wet eyes, now red and puffy. "I can't leave you here," he replied. "I'll only slow you down," Kyle replied. "Get out of here. Both those guys are still out there." Anders extended his fist, and Kyle bumped it. With that, Anders took off. Taika began smashing a key on the monitor hard. What was he? The key? I'd completely forgotten about the red key. Jimmy could help. A window popped up in the right corner of the screen, and Jimmy came into frame. "Hey, guys, how's the spooktacular event going?" "Jimmy, something has gone terribly wrong. The people downstairs are really getting attacked. One of them is bleeding out. He might be dying." "Whoa, slow your roll there, kids," That can't be right. Let me take a look at what's been happening. We're not kidding. Dude, something went wrong. I don't feel safe here anymore. We didn't know this was some dark web shit. Everyone down there is in danger. Oh, God. Danny, he's down there, too. Your friend will be fine. Don't you worry. Not everything on the dark web is evil. We just like our privacy, that's all. Okay, here we go. Oh, no. This isn't good. Boys, use the deadbolt on your door right now. What the fuck is going on, Jimmy? Ricky asked as he slammed the deadbolt into place. That's not part of the gig. You need to reach out to Danny immediately and get him out of there. He's in real danger. You're in real danger. I'll reach out to Tech to see if we can get the lights back on. We need to stop this now. Was this really happening? Was Jimmy in on this too, or not? The communication with Danny was still down. We had no way to tell him if this was real. Okay, I think I've got him, boys, Jimmy said. The lights to the facility switched on. It took our eyes a moment to adjust to the blinding light, and our eyes scoured Danny's path for him. It didn't take long. Taika immediately lost control of his stomach, thick fluid exiting his mouth. If not for the neon orange shirt, it would have been difficult to recognize Danny. He was a bloody mess, and his body was mangled. It looked as if someone or something had grabbed each of his arms and pulled until his torso ripped wide open. Then the lights fell dim again. "No, Jimmy, we need those back on," Ricky shouted. Before we could say anything else, Jimmy's entire demeanor changed. It was obvious why. He was grasping his neck, where a blade had been plunged. Blood oozed through his hands from the wound, and his body collapsed. Now on screen, we were staring directly at someone wearing the most hideous mask I'd ever seen. Is he wearing Danny's face? Hearing those words were enough for me to empty my stomach. The killer reached down and retrieved his knife from Jimmy. He looked directly at us and waved the knife. Then the feed cut. "Oh my fucking God, we're gonna die," I blurted out. Taika and Ricky stood there staring at each other. I looked around. That didn't just happen. Taika started mumbling. "What the fuck, Ricky? You fucked us. You fucking fucked us." "I didn't mean," he started. The realization of what he had done was evident on his face. He buried his head into his hands. "I'm sorry," he muttered. I don't know what else to say." They had no clue what was going on. Allison and Tana had been cautiously venturing deeper into the darkened depths of their set. They had reached the end of their tunnel and opened a hatch, forcing them to descend further down, where they were greeted by a menacing sight. The walls were adorned with upside-down crosses and demonic carvings that encouraged them to delve deeper into the game. "This set is totally insane," Tana said, and a burst of fire shot out from a hole in front of them, causing both of them to scream. "Jesus, that's hot. What's that?" Allison's voice quivered as her gaze fixated on a distant figure standing atop an altar. Unseen figures materialized on each side of them, chanting a haunting hymn. The dim lights gradually increased in intensity, revealing the entirety of the man at the altar. He was covered in red and black robes, with 3 horns atop his head, and patches of fur clinging to the sides of his attire. He clutched a cross with razor-sharp edges. "Yeah, no, I'm out," Tana said in a panic. They began to turn around, but the figures that had been humming were now blocking their way. Excuse me. Get the fuck out of the way. Thank you," Tana said, attempting to sound confident. They didn't budge. The demon at the altar hurled its cross at them, narrowly grazing Allison. A deep red gash appeared on her shoulder, and blood flowed freely from the wound. "It's not my style to sit here and wait things out," Ricky declared. "You've got to be kidding me," I said. "You'll die." "No, he's right," Taika chimed in. He grabbed 2 walkies and handed one to Ricky. "You stay here. You tell us if something is coming. You're our eye in the sky. Let's hope these work down there. I assume we're going for Allison and Tana." Poor Anders. Ricky nodded. "We tested the walkies, and they worked, at least up here." We quickly cleared the barricade, and they left. I slammed the door shut behind them. It didn't take long before they appeared on the screen. They bolted through the demonic door, but our attempts at communication proved futile. I looked back at Tana and Allison. They were surrounded. Allison's wound bled profusely, and Tana tried to hold her up with one arm while using her other arm to violently swat away the hooded figures. The demon masked. Man had abandoned his altar and was drawing closer to the 2 girls. He held the bladed cross out in front, approaching them step by step. I pressed the button on the walkie-talkie, my voice trembling. "Ricky, Taika, do you copy? The girls need you right now," I pleaded, my words vanishing into the ether. There was no response, only static-filled silence. My gaze shifted back to Tana and Allison, their situation becoming more dire by the second. The demon, now mere feet away, raised the cross, and the hooded figures all turned their attention toward him. With one quick swipe, Allison's flesh was deeply lacerated. She let out a feral cry as blood shot from her body. The demon lifted the cross again. He swung down once more, only for Tana to pull her down. Tana took the full brunt of the blow to her back. Tears streamed down her face, and the gash quickly stained the back of her costume with a dark red hue. "Tana?" Allison's voice quivered. Tana struggled to force a feeble smile. "What kind of person would I be if I let you die?" Relentlessly, he continued to hack away at Tana's back, and she persisted in protecting Allison. After yet another savage strike, her legs gave way, and her body crumpled to the floor. "Tana!" Allison cried out. The demon raised his cross high, going for the final blow. Then, a familiar voice filled the room. "Hey, fuckers!" Ricky and Taika stormed into the frame and tackled 2 of the hooded figures. Ricky quickly sprang to his feet and lunged at the man in the demon mask. He evaded a wild swing of the cross and took the man off his feet. Taika grabbed the 2 girls and helped them up. Tana's bloodied figure staggered, her movements feeble and unsteady. "What are you... You know what? I don't even care. Just get us out of here," she said. "Ricky," Allison stammered as she eyed him, squaring off with her assailant. My eyes darted frantically between the labyrinth of monitors, tracking the chaos with growing dread. In the midst of this bedlam, a sudden blur caught my attention. A lifeline amidst the mayhem. Anders. He had somehow eluded the clutches of the slashers and was crawling back through the dirt, clawing his way back to the graveyard. My gaze flickered across the control panel, seeking anything that could aid my friends. Anders had reached the grave, clambering out with the tenacity of a wounded animal. I had to act. And then, my frantic eyes fell upon a button, inconspicuous yet promising. "Anders!" I roared, my voice a frantic plea, transmitted over the intercom system. He froze, his eyes darting around the room, seeking the source of my voice. "They need your help in demonic. The girls are under attack, just like Kyle." Anders hesitated, torn between the headstone that read demonic and the promise of escape beyond the exit. His internal struggle played out before my eyes. He glanced toward the exit, his breath a labored rasp, then pivoted back to the gaping grave. Then he sprinted out of the building, I threw my hands up in frustration. I was angry, but also in no position to judge. I swore beneath my breath, cursing the screens in front of me when a sudden, thunderous thud shattered the silence. There it was again, a relentless, pounding thud. And again it echoed through the room, drawing closer with each bone-chilling reverberation. Someone, or something, was trying to breach the control room. Ricky swung at the man wearing the demon mask, connecting with his face and again knocking him off his feet. "Go!" Ricky screamed as Taika attempted to clear a path. Allison and Tana didn't need another warning. Their bloodied figures staggered, movements feeble and unsteady, but they did what they could to create distance between themselves and the others. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they fled through the dimly lit cavern. It didn't take long for the two men to sprint after the girls. "We gotta go. How are we going to stop them from coming for us? We have to crawl through that tunnel to get away." "The fire," Allison croaked, her trembling finger pointing towards the hole from earlier. Ricky yanked a torch from the wall and held it out in front of the gaping void. A few moments later, an inferno burst forth from the hole, devouring the cross in its ravenous embrace and bathing the cavern in a flickering light. He cried out in pain, as he couldn't avoid burning himself in the process. Taika and Tana, their faces replicating Ricky's frantic actions, brandished their own torches to conjure the flames. The sound of footsteps reverberated from further down the cave, drawing nearer with each passing second. Ricky, eyes wide with desperation, seized his flask and emptied it onto the cold, unforgiving ground. He tossed the cross atop the pool of spilled liquid and directed the others to do the same. The hooded figures were now within sight. As the encroaching horrors drew ever closer, a colossal wall of fire erupted into being, a barrier forged between them. The immense flames roared and crackled, splitting the cave into two distinct realms, one bathed in the hellish glow of the inferno, and the other shrouded in inky blackness, concealing their tormentors in a veil of darkness. The four of them backed away from the fire. "Allison, I'm so sorry," Ricky gasped. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her soft cheek. "It's not your fault," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She mustered a weak smile. That smile quickly dissolved into a cold, gnawing look of fear as the hooded figures materialized through the wall of flames. The searing heat devoured many of their bodies, causing them to crumble and vanish within the inferno, but two of them emerged relatively unscathed. With ghostly hands, they reached for Allison's ankles, their fingers scalding to the touch, and dragged her back through the raging fire. Ricky's gaze was locked upon the spectacle before him. Her screams were swallowed by the roar of the inferno, leaving behind a haunting silence. "Allison!" In an instant, Ricky went after her, charging headfirst into the searing flames. Taika and Tana sat back, unable to speak. Each passing moment felt like an eternity as they waited for their friends to return. The longer they waited, the more realization began to set in. "Tana, we need to go," Taika said softly. She nodded slowly. He threw her arm over his shoulder and they stumbled back toward the entrance to the cave. My predicament was only getting worse. As I hid under a desk, the door continued to give way, and the barricade wasn't going to hold out much longer. As if on cue, the door shattered, and an arm appeared through the hole. I held my breath. My eyes darted back and forth between the killer and the only monitor I was able to view from where I hid. Taika and Tana had made it back to the graveyard. Taika exited first and reached down to pull Tana out. When Tana grabbed onto his outstretched arm, he tumbled back on top of her. She toppled backwards and winced as her bloodied back contacted the hard, unforgiving surface below. She gasped for air as she struggled to move his unconscious body off of her. As she swung her arms around, she brushed against a cold, hard object protruding from the back of his skull. Her fingers closed around it. It was a knife. Standing outside the grave, just beyond the edge, was the man in the leather mask, peering down at her. She desperately increased her efforts to free herself. She squirmed and writhed to no avail. The masked man simply stood there, watching. He tapped his wrist with his pointer finger, and then shrugged. "Oh, fuck you," she spat. Finally, she managed to wriggle free from Taika's lifeless body. Then she grabbed the knee that had been embedded in Taika's skull. The masked man mockingly clapped and then backed off a few steps from the pit. "I don't even care anymore," she swore as she climbed free from the grave. The man beckoned for her to get closer, and she lunged forward with the knife. He casually swatted her arm out of the way with one arm and began choking her with the other. Her cheeks reddened as oxygen was forced from her lungs. A voice echoed behind them and alerted both Tana and her pursuer. "Hey!" yelled Anders. The man in the leather mask turned his head to see the boys standing alone. With every ounce of energy she had left, Tana swiped towards the man with the blade. He dodged. The edge of the blade grazed his neck. He released Tana from his grasp and quickly examined the wound. Tana collapsed to the ground, the blade falling a few feet from her. "This is for Kyle!" Anders roared, charging forward. The two figures wrestled in a violent struggle, their bodies crashing against the cold, unforgiving ground. Tana's heart pounded in her ears as she watched. Anders reached out for the knife, but his grasp was met with resistance. The masked man launched his fist into Anders's face, then crawled over him to grab the stray blade. The man slashed it across Anders's chest. A loud wail followed. He plunged the knife downwards. Anders' only reaction was to block with his right hand, which the blade seamlessly pierced through. The force of the stab brought Anders' hand down near his chest, penetrating his upper chest. He screamed in agony. The masked man gathered himself and stood on his feet, gazing at the victim below. Anders struggled but managed to dislodge the blade from his chest, though it was still firmly impaled through his hand. He weakly turned his hand over, blade pointing up, as he examined his chest wound. The leather-masked man lingered over him, seemingly enjoying the work he'd done to the frantic boy. One leg in front of the other, he bent down slightly to wag his finger. Anders kicked the man's front leg, which slid backward into the other, and he lost his balance. He fell forward and tried to catch himself, planting his hands into the ground. Anders flinched and turned his head away. The masked man's body tensed. The knife had gone directly through his eye into his skull. His arms lost function, causing his body to push down further, forcing the blade deeper into his brain. It didn't seem to register to Anders what had happened. He lay there in a trance, not even attempting to escape from the lifeless body covering him. Muffled shouts came from a few feet away, but weren't enough to shake his beaming eyes from the corpse he had created. "Anders!" Tana screamed again. She had crawled over to him and was using what little energy she had left to set him free. His eyes didn't waver. "Anders!" Her hoarse voice roared again. This time it seemed to register, and he turned to face her. He managed to free himself and slowly brought himself to his feet. Tana tried to do the same, but stumbled back to her knees. "Looks like your costume is ruined," Anders said, reaching out his arm. Tana nodded, tears streaming down her face as she reached out, accepting his hand. She wiped the tears away with one hand, staring directly into Anders's eyes. "Listen up, Anders. If you get me out of here alive, I'll let you do whatever you want with me." "Got it?" "Got it," he replied. "By the way, where'd you go? You came from the exit." "I called the police. My phone was in my car. They are on the way. I'm surprised you didn't leave. I thought about it, but something inside me compelled me to come back. You couldn't have figured out your shit a little faster? She whined. We were attacked too, you know. Kyle's dead. Those cops better hurry the hell up. We aren't done. What do you mean? Anders asked. She pointed. Leaning by the exit was the man in the blank mask. How long do you think you can hold yourself off in there? Came a voice from the other side of the barricaded door. As long as I need, I replied. I peeked over the desk to the hole in the door. I saw eyes through the remains of Danny's face looking back at me. I quickly moved behind another desk outside of his line of sight. Monitors displayed what was going on downstairs. Why are you doing this? I shouted. We don't deserve this. I don't deserve this. The man laughed. You self-serving piece of shit. You and your friends set this entire thing up so you could go viral off the misery of others. You didn't bat an eye at putting these people's most vulnerable moments out there for millions to see, all for your own selfish entertainment. Well, guess what? We're doing the same thing. We're just better at it. Anders seemed to have a renewed sense of energy upon seeing the foe standing between them and the exit. He yanked the knife out of his hand and headed straight for Blank Mask. Dim red lights flickered as the two men prepared to end this. The two men swung at each other with ferocity. It appeared to be a race to land a decisive first blow. It was Blank Mask who struck first, his knife finding its mark deep inside Anders' shoulder. Pain shot through him like a bolt of lightning, yet his face remained as expressionless as the mask of his foe. He took a step back and yanked the blade out of his shoulder. He continued to struggle with his opponent, looking for openings to land a finishing blow. With a knife in each hand, Anders brought the full force of the blades into the man's skull, one from each direction. He unleashed a frenzied assault, the masked man's body convulsing as a result. Blood sprayed in all directions, painting the surroundings in a thick red coating. Tana, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as her companion tore his foe apart. With every slash, Anders became increasingly drenched in the masked man's insides. The masked man's body had long ceased any semblance of movement. Anders, soaked from head to toe in crimson liquid, looked up and closed his eyes, taking slow, deep breaths. Tana began to sob. He climbed off the masked man's body and made his way over to Tana. Let's get out of here, Tana whimpered. Her sobbing quickly ceased and her eyes grew wide. She looked down at the blade protruding out of her chest. Slowly her gaze met that of her assailant. Anders simply smiled in return. Why? She gasped. Her eyes didn't leave his as her body collapsed, her legs no longer able to support her weight. Anders' pupils grew, and he bent down, leaning close to her face. Then he replied, I never would have guessed it myself, Tana. In this place, we were forced to do some terrible things, unforgivable things. As it turns out, now that I've tried those things, it seems I have a taste for them. It sounds ridiculous, but I'm thankful for this. If this hadn't happened, I probably would have lived out my life without ever experiencing a fraction of the pleasure I do now. For the first time in my life, I truly feel alive. Oh, and as for why, well, of everyone here, you were the only one who treated me poorly. Do you think I would have done the same thing to them? You didn't even apologize. Besides, you said I could do whatever I wanted with you. The door is going to break down any moment now. I hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but I know they won't make it in time. I'm not sure what's worse, knowing I'm about to face the monster breaking down the door, or playing a part in creating the monster downstairs. My friends and I played a stupid game, and now we're left with a stupid prize. They were right. No one comes out of Scare Lair the same. Story 2, The Candle Caravan. My girlfriend and I had been going through a rough patch for a few weeks, arguing continuously, having screaming matches with one another or not speaking at all. It all started when she brought up the topic of conceiving a child, and trying to be logical, I shot the entire idea down. I didn't believe we were financially stable enough to provide for the child's basic needs, let alone be able to give the proper affection and tedious care that a child needs and deserves. She argued that she could be a stay-at-home mom and provide the proper care for the child, while simultaneously maintaining the home responsibilities so that some weight would be lifted off my shoulders. But I saw it for what it was, wishful thinking. I'd have to work 60 to 70-hour weeks just to make ends meet without pulling money from savings. I wasn't having it. I barely got any time to myself, as it was. And as of late, I had barely been able to spend as much time as I had wanted to with my girlfriend. There was no way I was going to have a child. Not only that, but I respect and value the role of a father, believing that it wouldn't be fair to either of us or the child to barely have the time to be a valuable presence in my child's upbringing. We argued on and on, trying to force one another to give in to the other's resolution. But we were both stubborn, so that resolution never came. Anger, resentment, and sadness filled the silent air for weeks since that day. I wanted to end this bitterness between us, but I didn't know how to fix it. While driving home from another exhausting 14-hour shift at the construction site, I pondered how I could fix the situation between Maria and me, but nothing came to mind. Agitated yet determined, I decided I wasn't going home without a firm solution. I took a left turn onto a rocky back road, leading into the serene country forests, hoping that the calming scenery would clear my head and spark an idea. After an hour or so of cruising on the empty, snow-covered road, I finally felt the tension in my body and mind begin to ease up and settle into a relaxed state, the more I admired the natural beauty ever expanding around me. Suddenly I realized I had not let Maria know that I would be late. Coming home, so I shot her a text saying, "Hey babe, I need to clear my head. I'll be a few hours late." I wanted to say more, but didn't know what else to say. Almost immediately after I sent it, I heard the ding on my phone with a reply of a rolling eyes emoji and her stating that dinner was wrapped up in the microwave for me. I smiled despite the sarcasm and put my phone down, deciding to pull over into the base of the tree line so that I could sit and think. I closed my eyes so that I could concentrate, but that only made me drowsy, and I ended up drifting off to sleep. A loud bang rang throughout the inside of my truck, snapping my eyes open and towards the direction the sound had come from. Although I had left my truck running, it did not provide enough heat to melt the snow blocking the driver's side window, so I was unable to see who or what had made the startling noise. I stared anxiously at the sheet of snow between us until I saw a pile of snow get swiftly scraped off my window. Instinctively, I began to roll down my window and was immediately greeted with a wide-eyed stare from an odd-looking gypsy. I had to stare pretty hard to make out his features, since a black sky stretched overhead, and this back road in the deep country lacked streetlights. We gazed at one another for a while as an uncomfortable silence permeated the air between us. My gut instinct grew very alarmed. He suddenly raised an old lit-up Gothic lantern, which revealed the intricacies of his face and made me push myself away from him. He looked ancient and rather sickly, His sharp face was covered in a thin layer of wrinkled, pale skin that looked extremely oily despite the freezing temperatures and his age. Before I could say anything, he began to speak, and to my surprise, he spoke quite fluently and with a tone of elegance, saying, "I'm glad to see you're healthy, sir. I've been traveling with my daughter out in the country for many years now, and whenever we stumble across a lone vehicle in the night, well, it's never a pretty sight." As he was talking, I took a quick peek over his shoulder due to a moving light behind him, and I saw the shadow of a young woman's pale, ghostly face with shining emerald eyes peek from a small circular window of a camouflaged black caravan. I averted my eyes quickly towards another moving object. Fastened by ropes was a pitch-black horse, staring straight into my eyes and breathing abnormally heavily. I brought my attention back to the sickly man in front of me and muttered out, "Oh yeah, I imagine it's not safe out here during these hours, but..." Before I could finish speaking, I interrupted myself due to a shift I saw in the man's eyes. It was only for half a second, but it was as if excitement washed over his entire face, which made the blood in his body rush around the tight skin around his eyes, making the purple veins pop out. But his face had shifted back to normal, just as quickly as the shift had started. My body from the neck down was stricken by paralyzing fear, and I knew in that moment that he was a threat. Yet I attempted to showcase courage and quickly stuttered out, Thanks for checking on us. Get up on me. I have to go home now. I fell asleep for too long." Before I could say more, he interrupted me with a soft chuckle, while looking dead into my eyes, while slightly raising his lantern, revealing his own pale silver eyes. He quickly reached his hand through the window, grasping my shoulder, and began to give it a pat. His hand was slick with what appeared to be slabs of oil and smeared with dirt, and he quickly turned away towards his caravan while saying he's got a gift he'd like to give me. My thoughts were damn near screaming for me to get out of there. I was surprised they weren't echoing out of my head. Rampant anxiety and nervousness intensified within me to a degree I had never felt before in my entire life. I was unable to control my shaking limbs. It felt as if I had lost all control of my motor functions, while that urging voice in my head grew louder and louder. "Get out! Leave now! Get the hell out of this place!" But I couldn't move my limbs on my own. It was all involuntary. I had lost all control. The only thing I could do was keep my hyper-focused attention on him as he approached the caravan and reached his dirt hand through the black shade entrance and remain in that position, jostling his hand around. All the worst-case scenarios played through my mind as I wondered what he could be reaching for. Was it a gun? Was he going to blow my damn head off? Was it a knife or machete so that he could cut my head clean off and then cut my lifeless body open to eat me? I could do nothing but wonder and watch. Eventually, he pulled his hand back, revealing a radiant emerald-colored candle that shone radiantly through the black of the night. The old man's face wore a wide, tight-lipped grin, and when he stood next to my evidently shaking body, he said, "Ladies love a nice gift every now and then. Take this, my friend." I don't know how, but surprisingly, my paralyzing fear and nervousness emptied out of my body almost entirely after hearing those words, my eyes fixed on the ethereal glow of the emerald-colored candle. It seemed otherworldly. I'd never seen anything like it before and was quite surprised that it was a candle in the first place. But more importantly, I knew Maria would love it. Part of me still felt weary about the odd man. I mean, how did he know I had a girlfriend? How did he know this was exactly what I needed? I must have been admiring the candle and being lost in thought for a while. Because when I turned back towards the window to thank the man, I saw no one. Only the straps connecting the caravan and the horse rose and snapped, and the caravan seemed to glide away, blending into the vast darkness of the night. I just sat there in my truck, taking a big sigh of relief. It took me a while to console myself as I contemplated the events that had just occurred. I condemned myself harshly for allowing myself to be so careless. That could have been a goddamn murderer, and you just rolled your window down to some stranger in the middle of nowhere. You are truly a different breed of moron, and you're lucky to be alive, is what I told myself before taking a long journey back home. I had checked my phone and saw no missed calls, no texts, not a single notification. I don't know why, but that made me uneasy. I tried calling Maria, but got no answer. I figured she had just fallen asleep, so I let it go. Yet my mind kept replaying the strange interaction I had just undergone. The more I thought about it, the more I thought about how disastrous it all could have turned out, but ultimately, part of me was thankful to be alive. At least I had a gift for my girlfriend. I knew she'd like it. What kind of girl doesn't like candles? Although I didn't know what to say to her, I believed the gift would speak the words that I couldn't and would help reconcile the two of us. With that thought, I retained hope and enjoyed a rather peaceful drive home. I'd finally pulled into the driveway, breathing a huge sigh of both relief and exhaustion. No lights were on in the house, which brought a little tinge of sadness to me. Part of me wished that Maria was still awake so that I could give her the gift and put this whole stressful situation to a close. Before disengaging the truck, I glanced at the time. It was 2:22 a.m. A memory shot through my mind of the time Maria told me it meant I had guardian angels looking over me. I didn't believe in that mumbo-jumbo nonsense, but I couldn't help but crack a smile as I said to myself, I hope you're looking after me. I'm going to need it if I have any hope of fixing this. Stepping out of the truck, I took another glance at the house and I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me along with the urge to smoke a cigarette. So I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled one out, and lit it as I leaned against the tailgate of my truck, looking up at the ethereal night sky. I can't explain it, but for the first time in a long while I had been completely enamored by a feeling of existential exaltation instead of grueling agony. As I watched the slight twinkle of the stars, I counted them silently through the mist of my cold, smoky breath. I felt my body begin to subtly vibrate as the rare feeling of joy washed over me. I smiled up at the heavens, feeling as if they were returning countless smiles to me. A sudden tap on the back of my shoulder had startled me. I shot my eyes behind me and saw Maria smiling at me. Her beautiful pale complexion was illuminated by streaks of moonlight, and her eyes were now a luminous silver, staring into mine. She wore a black bathrobe that subtly teased the naked body beneath, which added to the intricate beauty of her. I hadn't seen her smile at me since before our fight, and I didn't realize how much I missed seeing it until that moment. We gazed into each other's eyes for a while, soaking in one another's presence, which could only be compared to ecstasy. Without a word, she slowly walked closer, never shifting her gaze from mine, until she stood right before me, reaching her pale hand up and gliding her soft skin up my neck, which sent chills all throughout me. She rested her touch on the corner of my mouth, caressing it, then sneakily took the cigarette from it and proceeded to take a drag as she turned her head towards the heavens. all while my eyes remained fixated on her, with heaven standing before me. Raw, limitless passion coursed through my body as I admired her. She didn't seem to mind. She was looking away from me, but she knew what I was doing. A slight smile peeked out of the corner of her mouth, but I noticed an iridescent tear swell in her eye, then proceed to drip down her pale cheek. She wiped it away before I could reach up and do it for her. Then she carefully turned her face towards me and broke the comforting silence by saying, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I could tell she wanted to say more, but more tears began to fall as she lowered her head in grief while backing away from me. She attempted to raise her eyes towards mine, but it seemed as if she couldn't bring herself to do it, for reasons I didn't quite understand at the time. As she looked at the ground, overcome by hysteria, she managed to mutter out, "I made a mistake I can't fix. I love you more than anything in this world, and I'm sorry I can't take it back." Mere drops of tears turned into overflowing streams. She cried more than I've ever seen from anyone in my entire life. Concerned and confused, I tried to take a step towards her so that I could embrace her, but she hastily backed away further and then began sprinting into the dark house. I was caught off guard and beyond bewildered, yet instinctively I took off after her. She was abnormally fast. She had already made it to the front door when I had just started running after her, proceeding to slam it shut. I made it inside while calling her name with concern in my voice. Not a single light throughout the entirety of the house was illuminated, and I heard no frantic sobbing or any indication at all that somebody was home. Only the white noise droning from the air conditioner could be heard. I looked around while shouting her name in the dark, but still heard nothing. This behavior from Maria was not normal. The feeling of dread began prickling underneath my skin. Something was very wrong with this situation. I turned towards the lamp in the living room while continuously shouting for her name, but to no avail. I scoured around downstairs looking for her, but she was not around. The knot in my stomach was pulled even tighter as I took a glance upstairs. That's when I heard something I'll never forget. A familiar voice possessed my inner voice and stabbed icicles into my spine as it said, "It's never a pretty sight." I knew exactly who that voice belonged to. The man from the caravan. I began hyperventilating once more while frantically pacing my head all around me, utterly afraid that the sickly odd man was lurking in my home. I shouted at the top of my lungs for Maria as I ran upstairs towards our bedroom. The higher I ascended, the more I noticed a faint aroma of patchouli, which grew more potent the closer I got to the closed door. I reached my hand onto the doorknob, but violently shot my hand back as I screamed in agonizing pain as I watched melted skin from my left hand begin to peel. It continued to burn until I vigorously wiped my hand on my jacket. As I did so, I caught a strong whiff of patchouli. Snapping my head towards the doorknob, I noticed a dripping, glistening fluid. I couldn't believe what was happening as I realized what it was. Candle wax. I glanced at my aching hand and was shocked to see that it had quickly turned bright red with tinges of purple as chunks of skin peeled off, producing a wet, sloppy noise as they stuck to the floor in front of me. I jumped a little at what I heard next, the sound of splashing water coming from the other side of the door. Powered by adrenaline rushing through my veins, I got up and gave the door a mighty kick, which snapped the hinges, sending it flying backwards. I ran inside the dark room and towards the bathroom, and that's when I saw her. Maria's head was just barely peeking above the bathtub, and my voice cracked with worry as I called her name while rushing towards her with outstretched arms, yet she remained still and silent. The bathroom was almost completely dark, barely being illuminated by the light of 4 candles placed in the corners of the tub. And that is the moment that I was confronted with true horror. I grasped Maria's half-sunken head, raising it up and facing it towards mine. Her throat was slit wide open. I began to whimper and sob as I held the lifeless, cold face of my dear Maria, the love of my life, in my trembling hands. "No, no, no, no," was all I could utter out. Maria's body was laying in a tub filled with fresh blood. Not only that, but it was bubbling and steamy, producing a haunting aroma that I could only describe as a mixture of patchouli, burning metal, and overdone rotting steak. I covered my nose and began gagging profusely as tears fell down my face and chunky bile built up in my throat. I had to get her out of there carefully. I grabbed a handful of Maria's hair and dragged her limp body down over the edge of the tub and onto the tile floor. My state widened when I glanced over her body and saw the transparent red wax that had covered her entire body from the lips down. Through the thin coating of wax, hundreds of thick, jagged slashes littered her body, and in her wax-sealed hand protruded a long black chef's knife. I screamed out in inconsolable rage and was ridden with terror. I began slamming my fists onto the bathroom floor as I cried and shouted. My teeth were grinding with such force that I cracked a fragment of one of my canines, and it fell right on Maria's wax-covered lips along with a wet string of spit and blood. The sight of it made me cry more. I felt as if I had desecrated my precious Maria's body. Something odd happened. The spit and blood mixture that fell onto the wax covering began to simmer. I reached my shaky, burned hand down carefully towards her still lips to remove the impurity that I had just laid on her. The slightest touch of my finger into the bloody tooth caused the wax barrier to crumble, and I watched in disgust as wax and the tooth fragment slipped between her parted lips and fell into her throat. My rage and sadness became uncontrollable. I began punching the tile floor, then the tub, and eventually began wailing at my own face as streams of fresh blood began splattering out of me and onto the embalmed corpse of my lover. I didn't understand how any of this was possible. I had just seen her outside, and it didn't make any sense. Endless questions with no answers piled up in my mind, and my sanity was broken. I began hollering for Maria to wake up, pleading that if she woke up, we could have a baby and fix everything, if only she'd open her eyes and look at me. I kept repeating, "Just please come back," over and over again, on a continuous loop until I once again remembered she had my tooth in her throat. I started shouting, only inches from her face, "Please wake up. You have a tooth in your throat. Let me get it out. I need to get it out." I went on for who knows how long, lamenting and producing more tears than I thought possible, all while shaking Maria's head aggressively in the hope that it would spark her back to life. Of course, to no avail. After some time, or maybe a lot of time, I decided I needed to get the tooth out because I thought she deserved better than that. I banged my blood-stained and battered face onto the floor as hard as I could to punish myself for being so careless, then swiftly stuck my entire hand. It was neutral, impossible to read, and we stared at one another until he spoke, slowly. "Do you see that lit red candle in the far left corner? Grab it and look at the bottom." Somehow I could see the man in my mind's eye, yet also see the red candle in front of me, as if I were stuck in two different realities. I didn't consciously decide to follow his command, yet my body obeyed his words as if I were being controlled. My injured hand reached towards the candle, and as I did, I was struck by confusion. There was a sigil branded into the palm of my hand, which I had not noticed all this time. It was of a circle with lines that pointed outward, like the directions you'd see on a compass. And in the middle of each of those lines was another line, forming the shape of a cross. I picked up the big candle, turned it over, and nearly dropped it to the floor when I saw what was engraved on the bottom: the antidote for adultery. The expression on the man's face changed, and to my surprise, he began to cry. And as he did, it looked as if his tears had caused his face to slightly melt. I watched until he spoke again. I gave her that candle this morning after I witnessed an unforgivable act. She was well acquainted with a man in an alley next to a bookstore in town. I did what was necessary. I know that pain. I felt like I had just been stabbed in the gut as tears fell down my face, but only because I actually believed him. Something in me knew he was telling the truth. Tears began swelling once more as I recalled the bookstore and the man who Maria had been with one day when I was picking her up from there. She was in that alley right next to the shop, and I watched as she hugged a man rather intimately until she looked over towards my truck and immediately let go and made her way towards it. I remember addressing it to Maria, and at that time she had said that the guy had given her amazing advice that she really needed, and that she only hugged him to thank him. We argued for a few minutes afterward, but she ended up convincing me that I could trust her, and I gave in. But now I knew that my trust had been displaced. My gaze refocused on the corpse on the floor. Only this time, my eyes briefly narrowed in with judgment and malice, only to widen again as I let out a giggle and a wide smile. Grabbing a handful of hair from that cheater's head, I pulled her face towards mine until our noses touched and began to laugh even louder as I mentally degraded and mocked her, then gargled up some fresh, thick phlegm and spit it across her face, then smeared it all over. I dragged the body aggressively back into the tub and bashed its filthy head into the hard marble surface, hearing a loud cracking sound as some teeth fell out of its mouth. I began to laugh again while the odd man in my mind's eye synchronized with my laughter, forming a horrifying, distorted symphony until we stopped simultaneously. With humor and joy still emanating from his face, he said, "Come on now, lad. It's more of a treat when they're alive. Take it easy." I don't know why, but the reality of the situation hit me, and I started freaking out. I exclaimed, "How would I explain this? How could I get out of this? It looks like I had done it. For God's sake, my tooth was in her throat, and the police will surely suspect me. What the hell am I supposed to do?" To my terror, the man's face changed instantly, from lightheartedness to stern anger. His silver eyes darkened, and I felt a burning sensation spread rapidly across the entirety of my body. I screeched in pain as I collapsed to the floor, frantically kicking and digging my nails into my damaged face. It had felt like I was cooking from the inside out until it suddenly stopped. The odd man's eyes returned to their normal silver color, and he gently said, "I told you to take it easy. You need not to worry. I've taken care of all the provisions. You must simply ignite the wick, and her presence will live on forever, like she never left." I clumsily lifted myself up against the wall while trying to wrap my mind around what he had said. What the hell did he mean by that? As if reading my thoughts, he said, "Ignite the wick and place the symbol on your hand on her head, and she will come back to you and remain loyal for eternity." I was shocked by the implications of his words, looking back at Maria for a few long moments until I heard a clank on the floor next to me. My white lighter had dropped out of my jacket pocket. I picked it up and crawled closer to the side of the tub, ignited it, then put it towards the wick as I placed the symbol branded on my hand on her forehead. The entire wick caught fire upon contact and produced a loud crackling noise like you'd hear from a firework. I backed up instinctively and ended up falling onto the floor once more. The man laughed at me mockingly and then said, "You're welcome, lad. Watch the magic of creation, the birth of eternal loyalty." I got back up and watched as the symbol from my hand began to engrave itself from underneath Maria's skin, and it spread itself from her forehead to the entirety of her visible body. Her mouth was engulfed in flames. I could smell her melting gums as they cracked and popped like hot grease. They smelled like rotting chicken liver coated in insecticide. I covered my nose and tried my hardest to keep my eyes open as I watched the flame spread throughout the entirety of her face and singe her hair, only adding to the horrid scent as the fire spread across the entirety of her body. The wax and blood mixture in the tub began to swirl and boil intensely, forming unnatural geometric patterns. It was faint, but I could hear the faint whispers and barely audible screams of Maria masked behind the bubbling and popping of melting organs. The foul odor was becoming unbearable. My eyes were burning, and it made me run out of the bathroom, gagging and attempting to breathe fresh air. I heard the bathroom door slam shut behind me as I dropped to my knees in the bedroom, coughing profusely. When I tried to get back up and watch what was unfolding, I was forced back down by the excruciating and burning sensation that I could only describe as maggots covered in lava crawling underneath the skin of my entire body. I tried to scream, straining my throat and voice beyond their capacity, but no sound filled the air except for the faint clicking of the bugs crawling within me. It felt like days of enduring severe punishment, straight out of oblivion, until it all stopped in an instant, and I once again heard the voice of the man say, "The worst part is over. You don't need to witness anything more until our creation is complete." Next thing I knew, my body went limp, and a wave of drowsiness crashed over me as my eyes flickered until eventually shutting completely. I could have sworn right before going unconscious I heard him say one last thing. "The gift of eternal loyalty comes with the cost of it. You belong to me." That was the last time I heard or saw the Candleman face to face. I woke up to the smell of cinnamon and soft bed sheets against my face as my eyes opened, watching smoke swirl in the shining light, peering through the window beside my bed. Groggy and confused, I moved my eyes towards the grooves in the ceiling until that vague memory of slamming Maria's head into the bathtub replayed through my mind. My grogginess faded immediately, and I felt the blood rush through my body as I felt fingers dance softly on my lips, tasting faintly of vanilla. I shot out of bed and stared in amazement at Maria, laying in bed like a Playboy model, seductively smiling at me, intentionally batting her eyes gently. I wanted to say something, yet shock overtook my anxious brain and left me blank as my body became possessed by intense uneasiness. I felt my legs shaking and going limp under me. I had no idea if I had dreamt everything that had occurred the night before, or if a miracle appeared before my eyes. She must have recognized my discomfort, because next she stood up slowly and walked towards me with a serious gaze that was both unrecognizable and familiar, not once averting her eyes from mine. I had never seen Maria make that face before. Just the sight of it brought on a minor headache. I backed away from her, bewildered at how any of this was possible. She stood right in front of me, then stepped onto my feet while looking up at me. She reached down slowly and grabbed my previously burned hand, which was still slightly damaged, confirming to me that everything I had experienced was indeed a reality. We both stared at my palm, which was somehow mostly healed. and out of nowhere, the sigil etched itself into my hand once more, causing me to grit my teeth and try to pull away. But before I could, Maria had gripped onto me tighter with the strength of a horse, rearing up and stomping onto me. She swiftly leaned in, pressing her lips to the edge of my ear, then quietly whispered, "You need not fear me, as long as you obey him, you obey him. I am yours, and you are his. Loyalty is not a request, but a command. I obey you, you obey him, and in the end we are all satisfied." She gave a little giggle and then kissed my cheek, which gave off a faint aroma of pomegranate and sent a subtle wave throughout my entire body, then proceeded to say, "I still want a child, you know." She stepped back with a warm smile that seemed more familiar now and then walked out of the room, and I heard her make her way downstairs. I plopped myself onto the edge of the bed, replaying her words over and over, doing my best to make sense of them, until I ultimately came to the conclusion that this entire situation could have gone a lot worse. I mean, I could have been charged with a murder I didn't commit. My future could have been to rot in a prison cell. But here I was with a miracle before my eyes. My girlfriends were alive. She smelled so good and was conversing with me without screaming or rolling her eyes. She said she belonged to me. That thought turned my confused expression into a wide grin. I could smell sausage and pancake batter downstairs, and my happiness turned to ecstasy. I thought, wow, she's cooking breakfast. It's been ages since she's done this. I could get used to this. Everything's going to be okay. This is normal. This is normal. She shouted playfully from downstairs, calling me down for breakfast. Her voice was hypnotic and enticing. I felt my body move towards the kitchen before I even decided to move. I got downstairs and saw Maria putting the last of the ground-up sausage on my plate as I approached her and kissed her on the cheek. We sat in comfortable silence, eating our delicious meal. It was perfect, and the sausage was unlike anything I've ever tasted before. I was about to ask Maria what brand it was until I was interrupted by a thought that had invaded my mind. I heard a distorted woman's voice in my head say, "Get in the car now and drive away." The tone of it threw me off. Maria must have noticed my expression because she told me to obey his command with that same unfamiliar and contorted, commanding face. The air around me became suddenly hot, and I swear I could see a flicker of light behind her eyes swirling around. The smell of fresh breakfast was replaced with the scent of burning sage and char, making me scrunch my nose. I know what she meant, but the voice I heard didn't belong to the man. Regardless, I got up immediately and did my best to appear calm as I grabbed my keys and got the hell out of there without taking another look at that horrid face. I kept repeating over and over again, "What the hell was that? What the hell was that?" I wondered as I drove down random roads. I wasn't receiving any directions, but something within me knew where to go. As I watched my hands become clammy and my stomach start growling and beginning to ache, I knew exactly where we were going now. I was being controlled by something that was leading me back down that back road into the forest that I never wanted to visit again. My anxiety turned to genuine fear, which made my limbs turn heavy, and my thoughts became corrupted with images of all sorts of possibilities for what or whom was awaiting me. As we drew nearer, the sight of the towering forest seemed to suffocate me, and I found myself antsy and unable to stop the car, even though my mind was screaming for me to get out of there immediately. I was totally helpless, a victim of my own flesh. The culmination of all these triggering sensations and chaotic thoughts caused me to screech at the top of my lungs, and I felt my hand shoot up toward the radio, turning it on, and then instantly, The sound of the news anchors' voices replicated those of angels. I was at peace hearing them, even though I wasn't paying attention to what they were saying at first. I just needed something to block out all the noise. I breathed in slowly and started laughing as I heard a joke the two news anchors were making about dogs dressed in cute Christmas apparel, slipping while trying to run on wooden floors. I laughed hard as I imagined a variety of dogs in ugly Christmas sweaters sliding around on the floor. I desperately needed that laugh. I refocused on the environment around me when I heard a strong whistling wind and noticed the giant trees begin to sway violently above. As I peered through the thin crack in between the trees, I noticed a monstrous storm cloud lurking in my direction. I knew this wouldn't be good. If I continued driving under the branches, my truck would inevitably be damaged or crushed altogether by the debris of falling branches. I had to get my truck somewhere safe. And as soon as that thought appeared, I felt my hand jerk the wheel to the right towards a small space in between the trees, barely large enough to get a clear view of the darkening sky above. My foot pressed down on the brake without my consent, and it made a sudden, jerking stop. I heard the radio's volume rise. Glitchy, distorted voices masked by white noise rang throughout the inside of the car until I willfully turned the knob slightly, and with full clarity, I heard one of the news anchors say the following. Breaking news. Here in Minneapolis, a local bookstore owner was discovered brutally murdered within his personal office within the bookstore premises by a work colleague. Authorities have identified the victim as Jason Grimm. Authorities have also stated that the victim was found around 9 a.m. this morning, sprawled out on the floor with hundreds of slashes across his body, yet nearly drained of all his blood. The authorities and forensics department were baffled by another horrifying discovery. The victim of this terrifying act of murder was found missing large chunks of flesh, along with numerous vital organs. The family of Jason Grimm is in complete shock. I wailed at the radio continuously until I heard the voices fade out, then began projectile vomiting all over the dashboard and onto my lap. As I did so, the memory of Maria making sausage replayed throughout my mind. Only this time her face was staring dead at me with a horrifying grin. I knew immediately what I had eaten and began crying and screaming uncontrollably until more vomit shot out of me. My muscles were clenched and clammy as I began hopping and shifting frantically in my seat. I couldn't think straight, but knew how damned I truly was. The horrifying reality was starting to set in, and the thought of prison or death itself seemed more comforting than the hell I was currently experiencing. My conscious awareness was shifting from first person to third person, back and forth. I could see the entire unnerving and disgusting scene play out from multiple angles, as if I were in the back seat and the passenger seat beside me. Streams of tears kept leaking out as I hunched down into a ball and gripped my head with my wet, vomit-covered hands as I shook in my seat for what felt like an eternity. As I looked down at the floor, I saw the shades of light shining in quickly vanish, becoming replaced by an unnatural darkness. The wind grew mightier, not like a howl, but rather like a ferocious roar echoing throughout the forest as branches began slamming to the ground around the truck. I became so hyper-aware of my surroundings, yet somehow another fragment of my consciousness was disassociating. Shivering relentlessly and unable to control my motor functions, I stared blankly at the puke on the dashboard, feeling myself drift away, until I noticed a shining figure slightly move in the tree line, in the blur of my vision. I focused in and saw a woman in the distance, about 30 yards away. She had black hair covering most of her face, and she was wearing a white dress. I could tell she was staring directly at me. My red eyes widened as I realized who it was. It was Maria. I blinked my eyes, and in an instant, she had disappeared. I rubbed my eyes frantically, nearly getting puke in them, and shot a glance back at where the familiar figure was standing, yet saw nothing but the swaying trees. But then I felt a wet and bitter cold touch on my cheek. I screeched and shot back towards the door and looked beside me to see Maria. She was sitting beside me, looking into my eyes with sorrow. The sound of the wind seemed to go silent as she looked at me. She was practically glowing amidst the dark atmosphere, and the closer I looked, the more I noticed that her skin was slightly transparent. I was too confused to speak. I could only stare, but somehow I felt safe and calm. Something in me told me that what I was seeing was pure. I knew what I was witnessing. It was abnormal, but the best kind of abnormal that I had experienced recently. I examined her carefully and noticed the green candle I had intended to give her placed in her lap, amazed that it had been forgotten about. She looked down at the luminous candle in her lap, then back at me. She slowly leaned in and whispered, "I'm sorry. I've felt the love you've had for me like I never could have before, but it's all over now. I'm sorry that I can't fix my mistakes. I can only help you with yours. Never go back. I am what you're seeking, and I will always protect you, but you will never see me again." She pulled away from me with a weak smile, and in her hand was my white lighter. She looked up at me again with that faint, beautiful smile, and the next thing I knew, my body was sent soaring through the air and into the forest, until my body smacked into a hard surface, and my senses shut off completely. I slept without a nightmare, no otherworldly visions. I was pure awareness in a black void of silence. When my eyes had opened, I was surprised to wake up on Earth, temporarily forgetting what being alive meant. The sound of birds chirping and leaves swaying must have woken me up. Looking down, I saw piles of white maggots piling up to feed on the vomit smeared across my soaking wet clothing and across my cut-up skin. When I reached to swipe them off, my ribs and arms protested by sending waves of aching pain that seemed to stab into my bones. I could still move them and managed to get the disgusting little worm-like creatures off of me, so I was at least pleased that I hadn't broken a bone. When I tried moving my legs, I was even more surprised that I could wiggle them without so much as an ache. I stood up, a little wobbly, and gazed around. When I had turned my head backwards, I had noticed my body had slammed into a thick oak tree. I couldn't believe I was even alive or had the ability to stand after colliding with it. It was truly a miracle. I shot my glance back and noticed my truck, or what was left of it anyway, as a heaping mess of scorched and jagged car parts, along with broken fragments of black-stained glass, littered the dirt road. It looked like a bomb had gone off. I was utterly confused as to how such a thing could have happened. Mary wasn't in sight. There was nothing suspicious at all, only stupid auto parts. I dug through the wreckage tediously, trying to find a hidden letter or some sort of answer, but there was nothing to be found. Eventually, I gave up and wandered ever so slowly out of that forest and far away from my home. I had this intuitive knowing, along with Mary's advice, that I should never step foot in that house or in that town, ever again. And I listened. Hours passed of walking along the empty back roads, battling excruciating pain, and using every bit of my willpower to keep marching forward, when I finally came across a truck stop diner. right when darkness began to permeate the sky. This is where I am now, sitting alone and damaged while sipping crappy coffee while I write this. I have only a few dollars in my wallet, no cell phone, no vehicle. I don't know what I'm going to do or where I'm going to go next, but I'm sure I'll figure something out. At least, I hope. There aren't many customers in here. A few have given me odd glances due to my disheveled appearance, but one of the waitresses here has kept staring at me over and over again, and she doesn't even try to hide it. She's walked by me a few times, and each time she does, she smells different. It reminds me of Maria. I think I need to get out of here. I just watched her gift a small blue candle to a trucker who walked in. And after she did so, she looked straight at me with a menacing smile that sent chills throughout my body. And I swear I saw her eyes shift from a light green to silver. If you ever come across a caravan or an old man selling candles, get the hell out of there. If someone ever gives you a candle, smash it on the ground or refuse it outright and never light it. If someone smells like a variety of different candle scents, never speak to them and leave immediately. I still don't know what I'm going to do about the old man, and I don't think there's anything I can do until he takes control over what belongs to him. Story 3. Pale Face. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. It was supposed to be innocent when it started, but it spiraled so far out of control that I don't know how I'm going to ever escape this. After 2 months of bland summer August finally hit, and I was completely done with the hot sun. I'd just finished college in the spring, and there wasn't much to do in my hometown. I spent most of my days hiking in the woods and hanging out with my few friends. At night, I enjoyed drinking and listening to real-life horror stories. I don't know why, but real-life scary stories always fascinated me. The idea of what you see in horror films occurring in our reality was so heart-pounding, it always perked me up and put me on edge. I loved that feeling more than anything. Being scared and full of adrenaline made me feel like I was fulfilling my life's purpose. Some people spent their whole lives trying to find their passion, and at the age of 14, I already knew mine was fear. My days got so boring as it was particularly hot, and I had no desire to go out in the sun. I began to think more and more about the videos I watched and how I felt when I saw them. I had just watched one about the scariest real-life stalker experiences, and it really stuck with me. I thought the feeling of being followed like that, or following someone, would give everyone involved such a rush, a real feeling of being appreciative to have survived. Advertisements. The day it all started, I woke up late and had to get out of my house for a bit. I drove around for hours in the hot late summer sun, with my AC blasting until I needed a break. I pulled over for a second in a neighborhood about 15 minutes from my house. The neighborhood was quite large, and the houses were some of the biggest in the whole area. I let out a big sigh and thought about what I should do the rest of my day. It was only 3, even though it felt like 7, and I was so sick of being bored. I wanted to be truly scared, like the stories made me. Or I wanted to truly scare someone that same way. That's when it finally hit me. The only fun I could see myself having was doing this, as nothing else seemed even remotely enjoyable to me. I decided to pick one of the houses in that nice neighborhood and watch it for the rest of the day. It made me excited just to think about it, knowing the people had nothing to worry about because I'd never hurt anyone, but still mixed with the fun of giving them a bit of a scare was the greatest thing in the world to me in that moment. I loved the idea of making one of those stories in real life, and the thought that maybe this family would write about what happened made me practically giddy with excitement. I started driving down the street, debating which house to pull up close to. I chuckled to myself, as little did the family in the house I was going to pick know. But they were about to be in for quite a scary time. Then I saw the house I knew was the one. There was a family of 4 playing wiffle ball in the front yard. A daughter, a son, and a kind-looking mom and dad. I knew immediately that this was the perfect family. The children were very young, and the parents only looked around 40. The ideal choice for a horror story that people would want to tell their kids one day, to scare them when they're bad. I pulled up across the street from the house about 15 feet, back from being directly across from them. Then I waited and watched and waited and watched, knowing that if this was going to be a story that day, one wasn't going to be anything special. From their perspective, it would just be that brief moment in time where you eventually notice the car and say to yourself, that car's been there for a while. I wonder if they know the neighbors. The first little appetizer of terror, the calm before the storm. I waited until it got dark, and then I got out of my car. I was nervous at first, but as I crossed the street and approached the home, I gained more confidence. I stepped onto the sidewalk in front of their house and checked my watch. It was 8:56, and the only light that was on was in their living room. I envisioned that they were watching a movie and thinking nothing of the car they briefly noticed earlier in the day. I took a few steps across the sidewalk until I was in the very front of their yard. I could see them now in the living room, and it was clear they were watching something. I got nervous again once I felt the grass beneath my shoes and looked everywhere to see if anyone was around. For a second, I snapped out of my trance and realized how messed up what I was doing was. I quickly jogged back to my car and opened my door. I glanced back at the house for a moment and then got in and drove home. When I got home, I went straight to bed, and admittedly, I was happier than I had been in a long time. The adrenaline I felt that night was more than I had the entire summer before that. I finally drifted off to a very calm sleep. That night I dreamed I had walked across their yard, opened their living room window, and sat down with them and watched a movie. They all welcomed me like I had known them for years, and we had a great time. The next morning I woke up around 9 and tried to shake the idea of going back to the house. After the dream, though, it was impossible. I couldn't resist the idea of returning and following the family's activities. Maybe they would invite me in if they saw me all alone in my car enough. I could finally have a family that enjoyed spending time with me. I watched TV until about 3 in the afternoon, and then I decided it was time to head to the house. There was no point in fighting it. I wanted to keep watching the family, and on some level, I think they wanted me to as well. We were all meant to be together, they just didn't know it yet. I could see it clearly, and I knew it was up to me to make sure they learned the truth. I got in my car and drove the 15 minutes to their street. I slowly crawled up the road and parked in the same place as last time. There was no car in their driveway, and it didn't appear anyone was home. I turned my car off and glanced down at my watch. It was 3:22, and it wouldn't be dark for hours. I didn't care, though. I was just happy to be back on that now familiar street. I sat back in the seat and really examined the house. It was a large white house with 4 windows that were visible to me where I was. I knew one was the living room, as that was where I had seen them the night before. The upstairs 2 were likely bedrooms, I thought, and the other one appeared to be the kitchen. There were also 2 small windows above their garage. All of the lights appeared to be off, and there was no movement in the house. The calmness was fascinating to me, and I stared for hours at the house and yard, studying every inch. They had a pretty big yard for a house in this neighborhood, which meant a lot of potential for me. Even at this point, I fantasized about watching the way I was now from much closer, and a big yard was helpful for that. At around 6, the family pulled back into the driveway, and the 2 kids jumped out, bouncing around excitedly. I practically pressed my face to my window to watch them. After waiting for so long, finally seeing the family made it hard to stay in my car. They walked into the house without even glancing in my direction, which was good. I continued to watch as lights turned on, and it was clear that they were heading to the living room for another movie night. Just the idea of watching a movie with them made me want to run to their front door, but I restrained myself. It wasn't time for anything like that yet. I had to be patient. I decided I'd get out of my car and go farther into their lawn than last time as soon as their movie was over. I watched them on their couch, sharing laughs and enjoying some movie that I wish I could have seen. At around 9, the movie ended, and after a 20-minute process, the living room light shut off, and the lights in the 2 upstairs bedrooms turned on. They were only on for about 10 minutes, though, until both shut off. I looked now at the dark house that I knew had a sleeping family inside. It was fascinating to think how easily I could harm them now if I chose to. The perception of a fallacy of safety in a house is something that will likely get many people hurt. The walls are not steel, and the windows are not unbreakable. If I wanted, I could enter their house right now. I didn't want to, though. I couldn't do such a thing until they wanted me to. But my plan was to get closer tonight, much closer than yesterday. I waited another 15 minutes and then I got out of my car. I slinked across the quiet, dark street and onto the sidewalk by the house. I quickly walked into their yard, making sure I went about 10 feet past where I did last night, so close that if someone was in the living room, they would be able to make out my facial features. Luckily, no one was, though, and it appeared no one was awake. I decided to basically dare myself to walk all the way up to the living room window and look in. I glanced at the upstairs window one more time, and then I quickly but quietly approached the living room. When I was right next to it, I looked inside and examined the dark room. There was the couch that I was used to looking at. I saw another chair that was blocked by my view, and a lot of pictures on the walls of the family that I couldn't make out before. They all looked like such nice people. I loved just studying the details of their living room. Suddenly a light turned on by the stairs, and I quickly hid in the bush by the window. I leaned up some so I could just barely see what was going on. The son looked like he was coming downstairs to get something to eat or drink. The kid reminded me of myself when I was younger. So many options and potential ahead. A feeling that I had grown more than bitter towards at this point in my life. He ran back upstairs with what looked like a glass of water, and the light turned back off. I decided that I had more than overachieved for just my second night, and I began to head back to my car. It was easy to forget, but the chances that a neighbor noticed something strange was always there. If I planned to be here daily, I would need to be smart about how I progressed my watching of the family. I did a light jog back to my car, glancing up and down the street as I did. But luckily, I didn't see any movement. I got in my car and took one last look back at the dark house. I glanced down at my watch and saw it was 10:17, and I realized I was by their window for even longer than I thought. I smiled to myself as I turned my car on and headed home. Advertisements. When I got home, I went to my room and laid down in my bed immediately. My adrenaline was pumping, and I laid wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on what I had just done. It was such a rush, The family was literally in a scary movie, and they didn't even know it. I loved the idea of a real-life scary movie, and the thought of one that was safe but still real made me so excited. I couldn't even imagine sleeping, but after what was probably 2 hours of staring at the ceiling, thinking about ideas of what to do next to watch the family even better, I realized I fell asleep when I woke up at 6:30 the next morning. When I got up, it was just barely light out, and I rolled over trying to get comfortable. I knew, though, that there was no way I was going back to sleep, and then I opened my eyes wide as a thought hit me. I should go back to the house right now. I could watch the process of them slowly getting up and beginning their daily routines. Maybe they were leaving early today to do something fun, and maybe I could see that firsthand. The idea was so exciting I had to at least sit up in my bed. I looked out my window and saw the neighbors must have had someone stay the night. The view from my room on the second floor made it just barely possible to see the unfamiliar car, and it creeped me out. I knew it was likely normal, but the idea of a strange car on our quiet street was a sketchy thought, even with a valid explanation. I got out of my bed and got dressed with a smile on my face. If that family ever did see my car, they would need a lot of time to really believe there was actually anything dangerous about it. Even if it scares you, I felt like there would need to be a lot more evidence before most people would actually make the fateful 911 call. I quickly tiptoed down the hallway to my car, trying my best not to make any noise, as the last thing I wanted right now was to wake anyone up. I got in my car and began the now routine drive to the neighborhood. I got to their street and headed down it, parking in roughly the same exact spot as the night before. I put my car into park and checked my watch. It was 7:01 and just barely light outside. All the lights in their house were still off, and I got comfortable as I stared at the house, studying all the details, just like I had the last 2 days. The yard was really nice. It got me every time I looked at it. The grass was really well kept, and I definitely gave props to the dad for doing such a good job mowing. After about 45 minutes, the mom and dad's light turned on. It was 7:47 now, and seeing the bright light illuminate the dim house was an incredible sight. I saw clear movement in the room, and to my delight, the light in the kids' room turned on, as well as I realized the mom was waking them up. Quickly, all the lights in the house seemed to turn on, and it was like the Holy Grail for me. I watched with a huge smile on my face as all 4 members of the family appeared in the living room, just as I hoped earlier. It seemed they were all going to do something. As I stared, I heard a loud banging on my passenger's side window. I jumped out of my skin as there was a man in a robe who looked angry glaring at me through the glass. I quickly rolled down the window with an intense panic overcoming my entire body. "Hello," I muttered quietly. The man seemed to realize I was on the younger side and appeared to take a breath. "Look, man, I saw your car here for a few days straight, and I just watched you stare at this house for almost an hour. Like, what are you doing here? Are you staying at their house or something?" I panicked as my worst fears appeared to be coming true. He seemed to not know the family, though, as he didn't use their last name, so I figured I'd try and make up a story. Yeah, sorry. It's my aunt's house, and I'm staying with them, because my mom basically made me. But I've been sneaking out to my car a lot to watch stuff on my phone, because I can't handle being in there all day." I paused for a second and read his face, which seemed to be receptive to what I had said. I kept going, as I knew I could convince him. I wake up early to work out every day, and I guess I just got distracted, watching videos to motivate me, and then I saw they woke up. so I admit I spaced out for a minute watching them. My bad. I finished my defense and watched the man process what I had just said. He stood silent for a moment and then responded, "All right, I understand. Just don't park in front of my house. Park next to theirs. I don't get why you're over here." I quickly answered him, "Sorry, my bad. I just didn't want my uncle to have a hard time backing out. Apparently he's been having vision problems." The man's face softened at this, and he simply said, "All right," and gave me a nod as he turned and walked back into his house. I knew I had to at least move like he asked to avoid suspicion, but I couldn't believe my story had worked. It's amazing what people will believe. No one seems to want to have to put in the extra work and time of thinking deeper about what they may have seen. I turned my car on and pulled closer to the house as quietly as I could. The family all seemed to be in the back part of the kitchen as I couldn't see them, so I put my car back into park and waited. My adrenaline was through the roof. After getting away with my story to the neighbor, but then also having to move closer, I was both excited and terrified. I loved that blend, though, which is something I had never even realized before that moment. I felt so alive, and it gave my life purpose as I realized then that there was no way I could ever stop this. Nothing, not a big paycheck or a hot girl, could beat the feeling I had at that moment. The family then opened their front door, breaking me out of the trance I had been in. I quickly slumped down in my seat and continued to watch. They walked towards their car, and all of them glanced over at one point, but none seemed to take any interest. Obviously, I couldn't have known this, but it certainly seemed like there was no connection made to the fact that my car had been there before. They turned on their car and backed out slowly, disappearing down the road. I thought about where they may have been heading, and the different options were so fun to think about. Maybe they were just going for a walk or getting breakfast, or just maybe they were driving to an aunt or uncle's for a few days, and they were going to have an amazing time. I glanced towards their house with this thought in mind as something occurred to me. Maybe they were going to be gone for hours or days, or maybe even a week-long vacation to Florida, who knew? There was an extremely high chance I could enter their house somehow. It seemed like a bad idea, but I couldn't resist it. I looked around again and made sure the neighbor was back in his house, and if anyone was walking down the sidewalk. There was nothing in sight, and I actually realized that the neighbor was on my side now. And if I entered their house, he wouldn't think anything of it because he thought I was staying there. I laughed to myself as the brief confrontation with the guy scared me so much. But it actually seemed like it would help me a lot in the long run. I decided I would wait for 20 minutes and see how much movement there was, and if there wasn't much, I would move closer and at least try the front door. I didn't notice a Ring doorbell or any cameras, so it seemed like I was in the clear to at least give it a shot. Worst case, I figured there was a valid explanation for why I was doing so, and the neighbor wouldn't think twice about it. This was really crucial because the neighbor who had confronted me was the only neighbor who really had a clear view of the front door. The houses on the other two sides were blocked, so no one would be able to see me at the door easily. I waited until 8:20 exactly, and when I didn't see anybody on the sidewalk, I opened my door and glanced around. There was still nothing in sight, so I stepped outside and headed up their stone walkway in the middle of their yard towards the front door. It was nerve-wracking as I walked, but I reminded myself it was the middle of the morning, and the odds of someone being so off-put that they called the police was a ridiculous idea. I approached the front door, scared, as I knew it would more than likely be locked. I readied myself with what I would do if I grabbed the handle, and it didn't move. I figured I would just run back to my car, but I hoped that wouldn't happen. I walked up to the door, took a huge breath, and before I could really think about it, I grabbed the handle and pushed it in. The door swung open, to my absolute shock. This was a family of 4, a son and a daughter, who seemed to be so safe. The fact that they left their door unlocked disappointed me, as I figured that was something they would never do. I pictured them out wherever they were, not having any clue that a human being had just let themselves into their house. It was upsetting, but also exciting, as I realized it wasn't like it was my job to monitor how safe they were being. I should just be happy I got entry into their house, as the opportunities were endless. I took a deep breath and stepped through the front door and closed it softly behind me. I took another breath and really soaked it all in. Being inside the house was a whole different animal. It was so scary, and I was afraid I could get caught at any moment. That adrenaline I had fallen in love with was pumping, and I decided I'd just look at every room and be out of the house in 10 minutes, at most. I didn't want to take any big risks, as the idea of getting caught was something I still had to keep in mind. No matter how badly I wanted to spend the entire day in the house, I couldn't. I walked down their front hallway, into the living room that I felt like I was very used to by now. I peered through the glass at my car, and the feeling of being on the other side was so strange. Seeing my car from the same view they would have was such a unique thing to experience. It looked so creepy, just sitting there so close to the house. It made me feel uneasy even knowing it was my car. I walked through the kitchen next, which was only partially visible from the outside. After I got the downstairs layout down, I decided to head upstairs. I examined both the rooms, confirming that the one on the right was the parents and the one on the left was the kids. I felt guilty doing it, but I laid down in all 3 beds for a moment, as I couldn't resist the opportunity. There was also a guest room on the other side and a bathroom. After about 10 minutes passed, I decided to be safe and leave. I walked down to the living room and took one last big breath, soaking in the whole house and what I had just done. Just as I was about to head out, though, to my horror, through the living room glass, I saw the family's car pulling into the driveway. They must have just been getting breakfast and not going away for a week. I looked around in a panic, trying to decide what to do. I rushed to their back door and quickly exited quietly, just as I heard the muffled sound of the front door opening and closing, along with both the parents' and kids' voices. I ran as fast as I could to the tree in their backyard that was right next to the fence and hid behind it. My knees were still visible, though, and I got as quiet as I could, listening to the family inside. I was about 50 feet from the house, and I could just barely make out their voices. It sounded like they had just gone to get breakfast, and now they were about to leave again to go shopping. After around 20 minutes of hiding, I heard their front door close, and the sound of the car pulling away. When I was sure they were gone, I quickly half ran, half walked to my car, and drove away as fast as I could, without it drawing any attention. I realized in that moment just how lucky I was to get away without being caught. As I drove home, I reflected on what had just happened, and I couldn't help but smile. I realized, too, I had been smiling the past couple days more than I had all summer. This was real now, and the family needed to be weary because they were going to be seeing a lot of me. I couldn't help it. I had to keep seeing what they were doing. The rush was more intense than anything I had ever done in my life. Even booze or heroin could never have matched this. There was nothing like how I felt when I watched that family. The rush made me feel so alive, and I couldn't believe that I had just been inside their house. There was nothing on earth, and I mean nothing, that was going to stop me from continuing to watch them. I loved that I was in a real-life, scary movie, and that I had full control over what happened. I got home and realized how early it was, so I decided to just hang out in my room and watch a movie, as neither of my parents were home. I wanted to watch a scary movie to keep my vibe going, and I decided on It Follows. I loved how much I felt. Like the premise of the movie matched how I felt about following the family. For those who don't know, It Follows is about a mysterious force that can take any human form, and it follows a person until they either pass the curse on to someone else through sex, or they die horribly if the entity walking towards them catches up. I, of course, had no intention of killing the family, but the vibe of the thing following you, no matter what you did, really resonated with me, as that's the kind of relationship I wanted to have with the family. I mean, I wanted to follow them so long that once the kids went off to college, I wanted to have to decide which one to watch once they moved out of the house. I wanted them to feel uneasy, but not real-world, rationally scared. I wanted them to have a hunch they were being watched, but never enough evidence to prove it to anyone. I would have to be careful, but I figured I could do what I wanted to and never have anyone able to prove it. Just like a good, scary story. A lot of fear, but in the end, no one gets hurt, so they are able to tell the tale one day. I was in real life creating a horror movie. I was making something that was just a thought, a reality, and I couldn't think of a better way to spend my time. I was becoming supernatural, that mysterious fear, and the thought that you weren't really safe. Even if I knew they would never get hurt, knowing they didn't know, that made me more excited. To them it would just be a weird itch, suspicion, a fear at 2 a.m. that you know no one would ever believe, but it still scared you just the same. This is when everything started to go downhill, because unfortunately at that moment, a thought hit me for the first time, and it became impossible to shake. After watching the movie and thinking about the fear, I realized that maybe hurting them would be a good idea. Originally, I thought I wanted them to accept me one day and invite me in. That wasn't really true in my mind, though, and I understood that this would likely never happen. I thought that hurting them somehow was the only way to raise the stakes, to make it like an actual horror film. In the beginning, something like this was impossible. Hurting someone never even seemed like something I would want to do. But after watching them and getting away with it, I felt like it was my destiny to make this into the kind of scary story that people would tell for years and years. Those kinds of stories don't have to be told by the people who were involved, because what happened was so dark that other people will recount the tale. In cases like that, the people involved are so traumatized that they have no desire to speak about what happened ever again. It pained me to think of, but I knew deep in my core that a story like this was what I wanted, and not only wanted, but I truly believed was meant to be. I felt like it was fate at this point. Something like this was bound to happen one day in my quiet town, and it might as well be me who did it. I wanted to push these ideas out and just be a normal person. I knew, though, I was meant for much more than that. I had to continue watching this family, and one day I had to do something I would consider to be messed up. I wasn't sure what, until after only a few minutes it occurred to me. I had to kidnap one of the children. I had to watch the family, and then take one of them. I was frightened at the prospect of taking such a big step, but as soon as the thought crossed my mind, I couldn't get rid of it. I couldn't help the idea of stepping up the game and going from the subtle, itchy fear to the true primal terror of never seeing your kid again. That was the only way to move up to the big leagues and have your story remembered for as long as I wanted it to be. I didn't want to take one of the kids, though. The boy and girl both looked so happy that it seemed like actually taking one and making them sad may ruin the fun. I felt like it wasn't even up to me, though, and it was simply fate. I ultimately decided that this was all new, and that I should wait and watch before I even considered anything like that. Advertisements. I had finished the movie and thought about this for a while after, and my thoughts were broken by the sound of my dad getting home. I quickly locked my door to avoid having to talk to him. It was crazy how badly I didn't want to talk to my parents while I spent my time thinking about the family. It was like telling a group of people about a fetish. I just didn't want to be near either of them while I was in this mindset. I listened to my dad walk around for about 20 minutes before he left again. I let out a sigh of relief and then laid down on my floor, staring up at the ceiling. I couldn't shake this family out of my mind. I loved being in a scary story. I never knew how much I could love anything until I started having that feeling. Everything else in life now felt second best, and there was no getting around it. At that point, even getting caught seemed worth it as long as it had been for a good reason. I loved the thought of being involved in the scariest story ever, having people fear it at night and having it be passed down at a campfire to terrorize your friends. I had to make this real-life horror story. All of the ones I have watched honestly seemed so fake that the thought of a truly real one was too tempting for me to ever forget. In that moment, I decided for sure it was destiny. I studied the white paint on the ceiling and accepted my fate. I was the villain in a scary movie. That was me now. And I think I always knew it on some level, even though I never really thought about it like that before. I had to be the real-life monster because no one else would, and I cared about the story happening more than I cared about getting caught or hurting someone. I just laid there like that for a few hours, staring at the ceiling before I finally sat up as my parents both got home. I thought about what to do then as I heard them talking downstairs and didn't want to stay in the house for much longer. I glanced at my car parked on the street and caved to my desires and decided to go back to the house. I figured I could just watch without going too in-depth, and there wouldn't be an issue. I didn't expect anything other than catching a few glimpses and watching until they went to bed, which was totally fine with me. Just because this was going to end with their suffering doesn't mean we were even close to that point yet. A good story builds a suspense. All the worst scary movies and stories have the ending rushed, and I always found that so frustrating. You can't sleep on the subtle details, the slow progression that leads to a big finale. I doubted the family even suspected anything or thought something was off. That wasn't good enough for a big finale. Not yet. There had to be more of a build, more fear of being watched and the irrational feeling that something was off. I had to have the family be on edge before going through with my final plan. We weren't close yet. We were still so early in the story that if I went for something crazy now, it wouldn't even be remembered. It would be a sad tale with the emphasis being on the child going missing, but it wouldn't be a true horror story. I needed the family to fear me in order to achieve what I wanted. In fact, I didn't need them to fear me myself, necessarily, but just the idea of the unknown and the feeling of not being safe in your own home. It gave me some peace to know that even though I was eventually going to do something dramatic, it wasn't going to be that day or the next. I had to let the feeling of fear grow before I could strike. That was the only way to make this the kind of story that would be worth it in the long run. Sure, it was fun to scare people, but in order to be a level above just scaring people, it had to have a true narrative, a beginning, middle, and the kind of end that would make it live on in infamy for hundreds of years to come. As it got dark, I left my house and slowly headed back to the neighborhood. I was nervous at this point after being so close to being caught and the confrontation with the neighbor, but I knew I was still in the clear. I think knowing what my long-term plans were made me more nervous too, but I was aware those feelings were irrational, as no one alive had any idea what my intent was. I arrived at the neighborhood as it was just starting to get completely dark outside. I slowly crept up the street, glancing at each side to see if there was any movement. There wasn't much other than two people walking their dogs who didn't pay my car any attention. I approached the house and saw that only the living room light was on. I looked at my watch and it was 8:14, and only going to get darker still as it was only a bit past sunset. I glanced at the house of the neighbor who had seen me and saw that many of his lights were on. I was nervous about this, but I reminded myself that he thought I was a relative of theirs and didn't think anything suspicious was going on, at least as far as I knew. But that seemed like the kind of situation where if he was suspicious, he would have just asked them about it. I crept up to the previous spot and barely breathed for about 20 minutes as my nerves were at an all-time high. After those 20 minutes of nothing, though, I relaxed and really got into watching. The family seemed to have movie nights a lot, and that night was no different. They seemed to laugh and smile a lot during the film. As the movie appeared to end, and it seemed like everyone was going to bed, the dad walked up to the window and glanced outside. He seemed to be looking at my car, and I got nervous again and slouched down in my seat. I averted my eyes for about 30 seconds and then glanced back. To my horror, the dad was still looking at my car, and he even seemed like he was squinting to try and see into it. My heart dropped and I looked away again before I ventured to glance back after about a minute. He was still looking, but less intently, and while I was glancing, he walked away into the part of the kitchen I couldn't see. I remember how scared I was in that moment. The dad was clearly looking at my car, and he seemed to notice that it had been there before. I wanted to drive away, but I calmed myself down, as there wasn't a big enough need to panic if he hadn't done anything else. The downstairs lights all turned off after another 15 minutes, and I let out a huge sigh of relief as the upstairs lights then came on. After another 10 minutes, the kids' bedroom light shut off, and then only the parents' was on. I watched intently for another hour until their light also turned off. I stared at the dark house and realized that this was my favorite part of the whole experience. The black, still house that I knew was full of people invited so much opportunity for a scary story. If I was a worse person, I would likely have broken in and made them play some kind of sick game. But that wasn't something I was capable of. I just liked the feeling of watching and considering all the different things I could do. It occurred to me, too, they must not have had any kind of camera at all, not just at the front door. I had been in their yard and house with my car's license plate clearly visible, but nothing had happened. This only helped to relax me and make me more excited to keep watching. As I looked on for 2 more hours, I really considered all my options. I still wanted to keep my previous plan of taking one of the kids. I just felt like that would be a true, quiet neighborhood, not safe, after all, type of story. And that's something that could devastate a community for many years to come. I remained looking at the house like this for a few more hours before I decided around midnight that it was probably time to get going. I turned my car on and slowly pulled out of the neighborhood with such a feeling of being alive that it was impossible for me to go home. I decided to get on the interstate and drive for a bit as fast as I could to keep the adrenaline going. I hopped onto the freeway and started flooring it and really reflected on what I had been doing and what I planned to do. I loved my new life. My old life had problems and girl drama and the knowledge that I failed my parents in their mind. But not this one. This life was full of excitement and the promise of being remembered. I flew past other cars on the highway and felt more alive than I ever had known was possible. I understood why serial killers did the horrible things they did. I didn't condone it, but I got why they would do something like that. The rush must have been insane, and I was determined to have that same feeling. I drove for about 2 hours on the highway, as fast as possible before it dawned on me how much of a risk I was taking for no reason. I got off at the closest ramp once it really occurred to me, and I figured it was time to head home for the night. I had been getting into a state almost like a trance where a different part of me took full control. That part wasn't scared of being caught, or the police, or any human being. I liked this part of me. I believed he was capable of violence even if I wasn't. I backtracked to my house, and when I finally got home, it was around 5 a.m. and just barely beginning to look like morning. I laid down in bed and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up late, around 10 a.m., and both my parents had already left for work. I sat up and stared at the ceiling as I thought about what I should do that day. Obviously, the only answer was going back to the house, even though I truly did try and think of something else. It was just impossible now. I wanted a good plan, something creative that would provide me with some real excitement. I made the choice to wait until sunset to go do whatever I was going to, in order to let the situation cool off some and to really build my anticipation. I decided that I would sneak into their front yard and watch the house through the kitchen window, even though I would just see a dark house. Knowing how scary it would be for the family made it worth it. I also decided I would watch horror movies all day in order to really get in the mood. The idea of someone right outside your house all night without anyone knowing creeped me out so much that I knew I had to do it to them. This was the progression of the fear that would ultimately lead to a disappearance. The tension really has to build, and the paranoia has to begin. It made me smile to think that the paranoia actually may have started, already based on the dad's reaction. Tonight, I thought, was the perfect storm for some noises and tapping on the window. Just enough to put them on edge and maybe investigate what caused it. Enough to be scared, but not enough to call the police. If anyone did investigate, I figured I would hide behind their tree again, as it would be so dark back there that I wouldn't be able to be seen. The neighbors wouldn't be an issue for that either, as the view from all of their houses was blocked, like I said before, and where I would be hiding had bushes obstructing the road. I decided I would arrive there at 9, around when everyone was going to bed. I figured at the very latest, the parents would be asleep by 10, so I would only have to wait a little bit before I could creep into their yard. Besides, I really wanted to watch the process of all their lights going out, and that beautiful view of their dark, completely still house. I planned to watch the inside from the window until around 3 a.m., when I would then start making some noises on the glass. I would keep that up for about an hour, or until someone wakes up. I also planned to park a bit away from the house after I watched it for a while, and they went to bed. I figured having the car there, if they were investigating the noise, may lead to a police call, and that would still be way too early. I didn't want to risk being sold out by something as dumb as my car's license plates. My plan seemed good, and once I was sure of it, I began to watch scary movies. I started with A Nightmare on Elm Street, and it made me want to put on a mask to scare them. I thought about that for a while, but figured the scariest thing was a person's normal face. No mask means they have no fear of being seen, and that is a terrifying prospect. Plus, every person's face, being so different, is almost scarier on its own than famous faces from a scary movie like Freddy, Jason, or Leatherface. Those masks and faces are so famous that it doesn't create the same fear as a face you don't recognize at your window in the middle of the night. To me, nothing is as scary as that. The realization that some random stranger is watching you for whatever reason. Your mind could go anywhere in that moment. Are they here to rob or kill me? Thinking of all of those factors, I decided not to wear a mask, as my own somewhat pale, unattractive face would scare them far more if they ever ended up seeing it. I watched a couple more movies that worked only to get me more ready, and by the time it was 7 and my parents had come home, I was anxious to get going. My mom forced me to talk to her for about 20 minutes about my day, which I hated. In this moment, I didn't want to even remember I had parents to disappoint. I wanted to be completely free of the feeling of letting anyone down. They were the one thing that didn't work for my plan, and I began to consider that they may have to go. After I talked to my mom, I watched one more movie, and once 8:30 hit, I couldn't even sit still. I decided to leave then and just take my time getting there. I walked down the hall and briefly told my mom and dad I was going to a friend's house. They seemed to believe it, as they had no reason not to, and I shook my head to myself, trying to forget how badly I wanted them gone. I got in my car and slowly headed to the house, stopping for gas on the way just to kill some time. I arrived on their block a little after 8:50 and crept up the street as slowly as possible. As I got closer, I didn't even see anyone walking a dog, which I took as a sign that it was going to be a good night. I approached the house and saw only the parents' light was on. I parked in the new normal spot and only had to wait 5 minutes before the light turned off. It was awesome. Lights out early was so encouraging on a night like that. Even though I was excited, I was also very nervous. I didn't forget how much a risk all this still was. I drove down the street for about 2 minutes and parked on the opposite side of the house. After I stopped, I glanced around, but didn't see any movement. Just a couple of lights on in the houses on either side. I wasn't worried about that, though, as I was far enough down the street that these houses wouldn't have seen my car before. I cracked the door and slowly stepped out and crossed the street. I walked as normally as I could down the sidewalk, doing my best not to draw any attention to me. I liked knowing that I didn't have a weapon with me either, so in the absolute worst case, there was nothing like that to worry about. I approached the house after a couple minutes and paused for a moment, examining my favorite view. The house just had such an aura to it now. I slowly walked up the sidewalk until I was facing it head on. I examined all the windows and didn't see any movement at all. I checked my watch and it was 9:16 and the neighborhood was quiet. I jogged as quietly as I could up to the kitchen window, and I adjusted myself between the bushes and the house in a way where I was sure I couldn't be seen from the street. I had to move a big rock, as it was right in my way. I set myself up so if I stood up from the angle I could see into the kitchen. Once I was squared away, I got up and looked inside for the first time. It was dark, but I could see the room, and there was no movement at all. It was clear that the room was very clean as well, and it was nice just to look at. I crouched back down and got comfortable as I planned to be there until at least 3 a.m. I didn't want to do too much at first, as a lot of people were definitely still awake, and I needed to be as cautious as possible. I planned to wait until 11 to even look in again. While I sat there, completely hidden from view, I felt almost as if I was part of the family. I touched the wall and pictured all of them asleep in that moment. I didn't even mind having to wait until 11. Just being there was the best time I could imagine possibly having. I couldn't explain the feeling, but it was better than sex or getting drunk. I wasn't bored at all. I was just running all the potential options through my head and pictured being filmed by a movie crew. I thought about how we were probably at about the halfway point in the film when the tension was starting to really pick up. I sat there like that until I realized how long I had spaced out for and checked my watch to see it was 11:06. I couldn't believe how fast the time had passed, and I eagerly glanced into the window, seeing everything still in the same place. It had been the last time I looked. After 5 minutes of just staring into the kitchen and trying to make my face look as frightening as possible, I crouched back down. It was such a rush to look in, and I couldn't wait for it to be 3 a.m. In fact, I thought, smiling, I should do one little tap right now. I reached up and, as lightly as I could, knocked 3 times on the window, quickly, pulling my hand back as fast as I could. I was so nervous but more alive than I'd ever been. After 10 minutes of no sound and no lights coming on, I peeked into the kitchen again, and nothing was different or out of place. No movement at all. I got back into my hiding spot with my adrenaline pumping. It was hard to settle in again, but I did after a bit and went back to my thoughts from earlier. A car or two drove past, but for the next 3.5 hours it was dead silent and still. It was a strange feeling to be in total quiet for so long. The time humans sleep and forget that there are creatures out there that are coming for them. I liked the idea of being a creature of the night, a nocturnal predator that spends the day inside and the night outside. My thoughts were broken by one more car driving by before I glanced down and saw it was finally 2:50. I figured it was close enough, and I peeked inside. Still nothing at all. No movement or sound or indication that anyone was awake. I took a deep breath and knocked on the window 3 times, louder than before, and then waited. After a couple minutes of nothing, I did it again and waited again. I glanced up and took a long look, but no lights came on, no sound, no sign that anyone had heard it. I knew I should be done. I was pushing my luck. But I had to do it just one more time, and then I could leave knowing I had really amped up the plot of the movie. I couldn't help it. I was fully consumed by this now, and I wanted to go inside so badly that I figured this was a good compromise. I banged on the window again and immediately realized it was too loud. I dove back behind cover and felt my heart drop. It was so much louder than the others, I was sure someone would have heard it. I waited tense for 10 minutes, but still nothing happened. I ventured to peek up and survey the kitchen. I crouched back down and looked up at the street to where my car was. It was time to go. I knew it was. I figured one last look and then I would creep over to the street as quickly as I could. I checked my watch one last time, and it was 3:16. I couldn't believe I made it this long and somehow wasn't going to get caught. With a smile on my face, I peeked up at the window one more time and saw the daughter standing in the kitchen, holding a teddy bear in her hand, staring right at me with the widest eyes I'd ever seen. Before I could react at all, she let out a deep, blood-curdling scream, and it seemed the dark house illuminated all at once. I probably could have run. I likely would have gotten to my car and never been found out if I didn't go back. That wasn't going to work for me, though. In a moment like that, fight or flight really does kick in, like people say. And unfortunately for them, my response was fight. I heard movement and yelling upstairs and knew I had to act fast. It was the only way to save the movie without it being a huge letdown. I looked around and saw the big rock on the ground a couple feet from me. The wide-eyed little girl had stopped screaming and now was cowering in the corner of the kitchen. I threw the rock through the window as hard as I could, shattering the still silence. I climbed through just as the dad made it downstairs. He also had incredibly wide eyes, and he screamed at his daughter to run. My adrenaline was in full control of my body. At this point, I didn't even feel like myself anymore. I grabbed a knife out of the sink just as he approached me. Before he could say anything or attack me, I whipped the knife out of the sink and planted it into his chest. He stumbled backwards and fell to the ground, gasping for air. This didn't snap me out of my trance, though. It only made me want to continue. I ran towards the stairs just as the mom was rushing down, and I grabbed her, throwing her to the floor before she could react. I raced up the stairs and saw the kid's bedroom was locked. I knew I didn't have much time before the police would come, and I threw my whole body against the door. It collapsed, and I jumped up quickly, looking around the room. The two kids were hiding in the corner, the boy in front of the girl protecting her with a baseball bat. I wasn't worried, though. I was in too deep at this point, and the little league bat wasn't. Something that concerned me. I ran at the kids, surprising the little boy, and easily knocked the bat out of his hands. I pushed the little girl into the wall, knocking her down, too, and examined the scene. It was time to put up or shut up. I had to take one of the kids and run, and I had to decide right at that moment. I picked the boy because of how much he reminded me of myself. He was knocked out, so I picked him up, which was easy, because he was super light. And I ran down the stairs away from his knocked-out sister. I stumbled down the stairs as quickly as possible and saw his mom at the bottom, motionless. As I ran by her, she didn't seem to be breathing, but I wasn't sure. I saw the dad in the kitchen, though, and he was definitely dead. I pushed the front door open and ran out, expecting a sea of attention, but I didn't see anything different. Some lights were on, but no one had done anything different than normal. I realized I still had the sun in my arms, and I turned and sprinted towards my car. I was approaching it when I finally heard sirens coming from the other direction. I realized the police were at least coming, so I began to rush. The kid woke up and realized what was happening and tried to push me off of him. I quickly grabbed him tighter and hugged him into my body to try and calm him down. But after 5 minutes of struggling in the street, he went limp in my arms. I glanced down at his face that I had been trying to avoid, and it seemed cold and expressionless, and I realized he had suffocated in my arms. It was too late for sympathy, and I laid him down in my back seat as I glanced around and saw nothing. I got into my car and looked back at him, but he wasn't going to move ever again. I looked at my watch, and it was now 3:31, and it didn't seem like much had happened other than the sirens in the distance that were getting a bit louder. I put my car in drive and left the neighborhood. I debated going home, but it was too late for that now. I just drove and considered crossing the border into Canada, but I decided not to. I opted to go over to the next town, and then the next, and the next, until I crossed state lines and realized my best bet was to hide the boy in the Adirondack Mountains. I buried him deep in the woods, feeling a sense of regret for the first time. I continued to drive, worrying about whether the police were after me. Plus, I wanted to escape the guilt of killing 2 people. I knew for sure that the dad and son were dead, and the mom may have also been. I continued driving west, and I tried to push these thoughts out of my mind. I couldn't, though. Every time I cried for them, it turned into a smile. I had really made a scary movie with real stakes. The neighborhood would be talking about it for 100 years to come. The town now had a legend, and I felt more accomplished than I ever had. But it still kept coming back. I had murdered people. At least 2 for sure. And I thought the police were definitely going to find me. After weeks of traveling across the country, though, nothing happened. I even saw a news clip talking about the missing boy, and they said they had no leads. I realized I loved the feeling of knowing the boy wasn't missing. He was dead and hidden deep in the forest. The rush of being the only person alive who knew that, mixed with knowing I was the mysterious suspect, made me decide to continue. It was scary at first, but I knew I wanted to. Over the course of the next 8 months, I followed and stole kids from 4 more families. I had to murder 2 more dads and a mom in the process. I got really good at it, and I always knocked on the window 3 times before I broke in. The part that I regret is once I had the kids, I didn't know what to do with them. The first one I tied up, but she wouldn't stop screaming, and I realized she wasn't going to. Regrettably, I ended up having to kill all the kids, as each time I tried a different approach. But none made any logical sense if I took them somewhere and let them go. They could tell someone, and if I kept them with me, they would make it impossible to break into any more houses. Without fear, they would try and escape when I wasn't around. I went state to state. Like this, leaving a trail of bodies across America until I reached Washington, where I'm writing this from. I finally snapped out of the trance. I regret everything I did. The kids, especially. I didn't want to ever kill kids, but I didn't think ahead far enough. Plus, after that first time, I felt like I had to keep it up. I'm wanted across America, and they credit me for 5 murders, even though the number is actually 11. I'm sure they'll find the rest one day, but I made it a difficult task for them. I'm also apparently known as the pale-faced killer. I always knew I was not very attractive and pale, but I didn't realize it was that dramatic. I regret what I did, but I do not wish I hadn't done it if that makes any sense. I won't kill again, I don't think. But what I did needed to happen. Excitement for the whole country. A scary movie for the ages. I felt bad about how out of hand it got, but I came to realize that it was the only way to do it. I feel terrible, but I don't wish I could take it back. I'm going to drive to Alaska now and hopefully live a life of no more fear and death. A life of reflection and calm. The thought of being arrested terrifies me now, so hopefully this letter will be found, but not lead anyone to find me. I'm not sure what will happen, or if I will end up killing again, But to whoever finds this, I really am sorry to the families that I destroyed. Just know it wasn't really me. It was fate. This park is beautiful, and I apologize to whose day it ruins that rids this. I want to be free of being this person, but I think it is who I am now. I always wanted to go to Alaska. I think the quiet nights will be good for me. I really don't know what will happen, though, so if anybody ends up getting hurt, I just want them and everyone else to know I am sorry. What keeps me going is knowing that one day they will likely make a movie about me, and I can't wait to watch it. This letter was recovered from a park outside of Seattle, Washington, and serves as the best evidence of a man referred to as the Pale-Faced Killer, who's confirmed to have murdered 5 people. 2 of the murders occurred in Vermont, 1 in Ohio, 1 in Iowa, and 1 in Montana. He is also responsible for the disappearance of at least 6 children who are believed to be deceased as well. The disappearances occurred in the same 4 states as well as Wyoming. Alaska is in the process of being searched, but we want people everywhere to be aware of the potential danger. Lock your doors, and if you see a strange car on your street, take notice of it. If you have any information about the whereabouts of the individual who wrote this letter, or think you may know his identity, please contact your local police department. Photos of the 6 missing children are provided below, and if you have any information about them, call the number listed beside the photos. Even though the letter states he does not plan to kill again, he is not of sound mind, and his word cannot be trusted. It is imperative that this individual is found and brought to justice for the safety of all Americans. Once again, please lock your doors and report strange activity. Thank you.